A corporate worker dies from overwork and immediately reincarnates into a new world as a 2-year-old boy named Van Nye Ferdio. He looks at his small hands and realizes he retains all his memories from his past life in Japan. His personal maid, Till, attends to him in his grand bedroom. Van is the youngest son of Marquis Jalpa, a powerful noble. During a grand family dinner at the castle, Jalpa sits at the head of the table and questions his sons about their education. Jar proudly states he is studying fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto focuses on general magic. Jalpa then asks Van what he plans to do. Van replies that he wants to study the nation's culture and history first. Jalpa expresses his approval, fully expecting Van to develop powerful fire magic just like him and his late wife Mira. Jalpa sets incredibly high expectations for Van's official magical aptitude appraisal, which will take place when the boy turns 8. Van quickly learns that this world determines a person's worth entirely based on their magical abilities. Nobles highly prize the 4 elemental magics consisting of fire, water, wind, and earth because they offer immense combat power for defending their territories. Anyone possessing an aptitude outside of these 4 elements is considered a complete disgrace to their family line. Eager to learn about his new environment, Van spends his days reading in the castle's massive library. He asks Till to explain how magic tools work. She tells him that certain ores and gemstones act as magic crystals, storing magical energy that allows people to craft tools aligned with their specific magical aptitudes. The maids constantly praise Van's intelligence, calling the toddler a literal prodigy. Soon after, the chief butler, Esparta, approaches Van to evaluate his current knowledge. Esparta tests the boy's math skills by asking him to add 2 and 3 together. Van effortlessly answers 5, shocking the butler. Realizing Van's immense potential, Esparta immediately appoints himself as the boy's personal tutor. This decision plunges Van into a grueling academic routine. For the next 2 years, Van endures a hellish schedule studying complex subjects from dawn to dusk under Esparta's strict and unrelenting supervision. By the time Van turns 4, his intense studies pay off, allowing him to read and write fluently. He also begins incorporating physical training into his daily routine. One sunny afternoon, Van spars with Till in the grassy courtyard using wooden practice swords. Till easily blocks Van's strikes, knocks him to the ground, and playfully declares her victory. Van pouts over the loss. Another maid witnesses the exchange and furiously scolds Till for disrespecting a noble, warning her that such behavior is a serious crime. Till panics, but Van quickly intervenes to defend his maid. He states he does not mind the informal treatment and playfully flicks Till's forehead to settle the matter and appease the strict maid. Van continues his physical conditioning, and by the time he reaches age 5, he easily fights on equal terms with the older soldiers in training. During one sparring match, Van swiftly defeats an older brown-haired boy. Instead of gloating, Van reaches out and helps the defeated trainee back to his feet, earning deep respect from the other boys who admire his humble attitude. After the practice session, Van sits on a bench to rest. The chivalric order's deputy commander D approaches and inspects Van's hands. D notices the complete lack of calluses and realizes Van spends all his time reading instead of doing proper physical training. D learns that Esparta forces Van to study 3 times harder than normal. Outraged by the butler's academic obsession, D vows to personally teach Van swordplay to make him the greatest swordsman in the nation. Van nervously asks the muscular commander to go easy on him since he is still a small child. D smiles and agrees, but it is a blatant lie. D immediately subjects Van to a brutal workout, forcing him to execute hundreds of sword swings and thrusts without a break. When an exhausted Van finally tries to rest, D yells at him to stay in a squatting position instead of sitting down. Van mentally labels his new instructor an absolute idiot. Despite the grueling daily combination of hellish studies and brutal physical training, Van feels a profound sense of satisfaction. He genuinely enjoys his fulfilling new life and decides to embrace every moment of it. By age 6, the entire city recognizes Van as a genius prodigy. However, the relentless daily grind finally takes its toll on him. Feeling entirely burnt out, Van decides to slack off and act like a normal child. He asks Till to take him to the local market so he can play outside. Till agrees, and they head to the bustling town square escorted by 2 armored guards. They stop in front of the massive Mary Chamber of Commerce building. Van marvels at the vibrant marketplace, comparing it to a large wholesale warehouse from his previous life. Their peaceful outing shatters when an angry older man drags a bruised, purple-haired boy named Kamsin into the square using a thick rope. The man loudly announces his intention to sell his own son into slavery. Van watches in horror as the man approaches Rosalie, a representative of the Chamber of Commerce, to negotiate a selling price. Rosalie asks about Kamsin's magical aptitude, and the man admits the boy only possesses thieving magic. Hearing this, Rosalie states the boy is worth no more than 3 large silver coins. Enraged by the incredibly low valuation, the man violently throws Kamsin to the cobblestone ground and stomps on his head, cursing him as a useless brat. Unable to tolerate the abuse, Van steps forward and orders the man to stop. The man tells Van to mind his own business and tries to drag Kamsin away. Van immediately offers to buy the boy for 5 large silvers. He turns to Till, who quickly hands over the money. The man snatches the coins, shoves Van aside, and walks away, abandoning Kamsin on the ground. Van kneels down, uses a dagger to cut the ropes binding Kamsin's wrists, and explicitly tells the boy that he is entirely free to go wherever he wants. Kamsin admits he has absolutely nowhere to go. Van invites the boy to come live with him at the estate. The guards warn Van that Marquis Jalpa will never allow a random street urchin into the noble mansion unless he is officially registered as a slave. Van asks Kamsin if he is willing to sign a slave contract just so they can stay together, and Kamsin eagerly agrees. Rosalie happily processes the magical slave contract free of charge since it is Van's first time doing business with them. A glowing ritual takes place, and a black Pegasus crest permanently burns into Kamsin's hand, marking him as Van's official servant. Sometime later, Kamsin finds Van hiding in the mansion's hallway and warns him that Deputy Commander D is searching for him to begin sword practice. Desperate to skip the grueling session, Van offers Kamsin a sweet bun as a bribe to lie to D and say he could not find him. Kamsin points out that D likely already knows Van is hiding there. Suddenly, D spots them in the hallway. Van attempts to play dumb, but D notices the fresh pastry crumbs covering Van's mouth. Van quickly wipes his face, but D refuses to fall for the obvious deception. Noticing Kamsin's excellent physical build, D grabs the newly acquired slave by the arm and drags him away to endure the brutal training session in Van's place. Van quietly apologizes to Kamsin from the safety of his hiding spot. 2 years pass, and Van finally turns 8, the age required for the official magical aptitude appraisal. A massive rainstorm rages outside the castle as Jalpa summons Van, Mercia, and several others to the dimly lit Grand Hall to reveal the results. The outcome is catastrophic. Jalpa furiously announces that Van possesses absolutely no aptitude for any of the 4 elemental magics. Instead, Van is cursed with production magic, the most useless and disrespected magic type in the entire kingdom. Production magic only allows the user to craft basic items like swords and accessories, tasks that ordinary blacksmiths easily perform without any magical abilities at all. Jalpa completely loses his temper, viewing Van as a massive failure and a shameful disgrace to the powerful legacy of his late wife, Mira. Consumed by rage, Jalpa draws a glowing turquoise sword and raises it high above his head, fully intending to execute his own son on the spot. Van stares up at the descending blade in sheer terror, desperately trying to figure out a way to survive. Just before Jalpa strikes the fatal blow, the eldest brother Mercia steps in and presents an alternative solution. Mercia suggests exiling Van to a remote, nameless village located on the extreme edge of their territory. He explains that the village is deeply impoverished, lacks any valuable resources, and borders the hostile rival kingdom of Yeleneta. Appointing Van as the symbolic lord of this useless frontier town would effectively remove him from the family without the need for bloodshed. Jalpa calms down, agrees with the logic, and strictly orders Van to pack his things and leave the castle immediately. Later, in the hallway, Mercia kneels down and sincerely apologizes to Van for proposing such a harsh exile, explaining he only did it because he could not bear to watch their father murder him. Van holds zero resentment and actually grabs Mercia's hand, genuinely thanking his older brother for saving his life. While the rest of the household considers the exile a massive tragedy, Van is secretly thrilled. He figures that being the lord of a neglected rural village means he will have no responsibilities and can finally live the fun, laid-back life he always desired. He plans to develop the remote territory entirely to his own liking. The next morning, Van stands outside the castle gates as the servants load his luggage into a carriage. Jalpa refuses to provide Van with any official chivalric order knights for protection, so Mercia privately hires a small group of adventurers to escort the convoy. Till rushes out to the courtyard, furiously grabbing her skirt, and demands to accompany Van as his personal maid. Van happily agrees to take her along. Suddenly, D arrives in full armor and announces his intention to join the expedition. D explains that he took early retirement, passed his duties to a successor, and got Jalpa's permission to leave the capital just to continue teaching Van swordplay. A moment later, Espada also appears in his purple suit. The chief butler reveals he also retired from his post, wanting to spend his final years supervising Van's academic studies for his own personal entertainment. Two loyal guards, Arb and Law, also step forward to join the traveling party. Van's father strictly ordered the departure to be a quiet, secret affair to hide the family's shame. However, Dee completely ignores the order. He sets up massive celebratory banners across the town and gathers a huge crowd of citizens to give Van a proper send-off. The townspeople line the streets, cheering loudly and waving goodbye to the young prodigy they all admire. Sitting inside his carriage, Van realizes he was secretly feeling a little depressed about leaving his home in disgrace. The overwhelming support from the crowd instantly cures his anxiety. Filled with newfound excitement and gratitude, Van waves cheerfully from the carriage window, ready to embrace his new life as the carriage rolls out toward the untamed frontier. Inside the moving carriage, Van continues to practice his production magic by channeling his energy into a small wooden stick. The stick glows with a bright blue and yellow magical energy and seamlessly transforms into a black fountain pen. He tells Till and Kamsin that he wants to start using his magic more often and hopes to find a practical application for it. Kamsin assures Van that he will serve him forever, completely unfazed by the potential dangers of their new life on the frontier. Van tells Kamsin that he can return to the manor if he hates the frontier, offering to permanently release him from the slave contract so his older brother can take care of him. However, Kamsin earnestly refuses, stating that he admires Van deeply and wants to dedicate his entire life to serving him no matter what happens. Van blushes and awkwardly laughs, pointing out that Kamsin is being overly intense and joking that it almost sounds like a marriage proposal. Their peaceful conversation is suddenly cut short when Dee rides up to the carriage window and urgently reports that the village they are heading to is currently under attack. The group quickly rushes to the outskirts of the settlement and observes the situation from the cover of the dense forest. Van quickly analyzes the enemy forces, estimating that there are about 50 bandits or washed-up mercenaries assaulting the village's wooden palisade. The villagers are locked inside, relying on a turtle-like defense to survive the relentless arrow fire raining down on them. Dee eagerly asks for permission to charge in with his knights to stop the attackers, but Ortho, the leader of the hired adventurers, immediately shuts the idea down. He argues that charging blindly into a force that large is extremely dangerous and reminds everyone that his team was only hired to escort Van safely to his destination. Ortho refuses to take part in a suicide mission that risks his comrades' lives. Dee angrily counters that this village belongs to their lord and they must draw their swords to protect his citizens. Espada intervenes to calm the situation, proposing a tactical sequence of surprise attacks to improve their chances of victory. He reveals that he is actually a highly skilled elemental mage and plans to erect a defensive wall right in the middle of the battlefield. The adventurers can then safely fire ranged attacks from behind his wall to draw the bandits' attention, which will allow Dee and his knights to charge in from the flank and wipe them out. Van immediately objects to the plan, worried that Espada will be killed while acting as the primary decoy. He reminds everyone that Espada and Dee are crucial for developing his new territory, and losing them would result in his father executing him for failure. Instead, Van volunteers to act as the decoy himself. He plans to ride his carriage straight into the enemy lines to draw their fire. Till completely panics, grabbing her dress and begging to take his place, while Van calmly explains that he has been practicing swordplay with Dee every day and won't die easily. He adds that even if he does fall, dying for his people is the best end a lord could ask for, and announcing his demise would only cause trouble for his abusive family anyway. Before the battle begins, Van takes a moment to speak directly with Ortho, Pluriel, and the other adventurers. The adventurers initially complain about nobles being arrogant and looking down on commoners, but Van approaches them with complete respect. He introduces himself politely, thanks them for their hard work, and calls Ortho a veteran hero. This completely catches the adventurers off guard. Pluriel admits that she used to ridicule the idea of noble resolve, but seeing a young boy willing to risk his own life to protect his people completely changes her mind. Impressed by Van's humility and the fact that he actually bothered to memorize their names, the adventurers agree to fully commit to the battle and trust him with their lives. Espada tells Van that once they drive the bandits away, he will teach him the true responsibilities of a Marquis heir. The group then moves into position to execute Espada's amended strategy. Espada steps into the clearing, slams his hands into the dirt, and unleashes a massive pillar of golden magical energy. The earth violently shifts, and a massive stone wall erupts from the ground right in front of the bandit forces. Ortho and his team are blown away by the old butler's immense magical power. Taking advantage of the confusion, the villagers and adventurers immediately unleash a relentless volley of arrows and magical light spears from behind the newly formed wall. The bandits panic as their comrades are struck down, completely caught off guard by the sudden bombardment. The bandit leader quickly realizes they are being attacked from behind the wall and orders his men to charge the structure. Just as they rush forward, D and his knights burst from the trees on the left flank. D swings his massive broadsword with terrifying speed, launching powerful shockwaves that send entire groups of bandits flying through the air. Blood sprays across the grass as the heavily armored knights easily carve through the disorganized enemy ranks. At the exact same time, Ortho and his adventurers launch their own assault from the right flank, successfully executing a perfect pincer maneuver. The bandits scream in terror as they realize they are entirely surrounded and outmatched. Despite the overwhelming assault, a large bandit wielding a heavy axe manages to break through the front line and scales the rocky terrain to target the mages. Ortho tries to intercept him, but he gets tied up fighting other enemies and desperately yells for someone to stop the giant man. The bandit reaches Pluriel and forcefully swings his wooden staff, pushing her back into a narrow crevice. Just as he prepares to deliver a fatal blow, Van suddenly lunges out of nowhere with incredible speed. Using the agility he developed from his intense training, Van slides past the massive attacker and slices him with a precise sword strike, killing him instantly and sending blood flying. Pluriel and the other adventurers watch in absolute shock as the young boy effortlessly takes down the massive warrior. Pluriel quickly regains her composure and finishes off the remaining enemies with a massive pillar of red magical energy. Esparta observes Van from a distance, quietly realizing that the boy possesses an extraordinary combat potential that completely defies all expectations. The battle concludes quickly with the bandits suffering heavy losses and the surviving members being tied up with ropes. Van's forces suffer absolutely zero casualties, achieving the best possible outcome. The other mercenary groups collect their pay and depart, but Ortho, Pluriel, and their immediate team decide to stick around. Ortho points out that Van is unlike any noble they have ever met, and Pluriel wants to repay the boy for saving her life. They all agree to stay and help Van develop his new territory simply because they are curious to see what he will accomplish next. Back at the camp, Till runs up to Van crying hysterically, grabbing him by the collar and aggressively scolding him for putting himself in danger again. She begs him to let her risk her life first next time. Van awkwardly apologizes and promises to be more careful just to calm her down. The group then marches proudly to the village gates. The villagers cautiously gather around as Van introduces himself as their new lord. The village chief, Rhonda, steps forward and thanks them for saving the settlement. Van asks why the village gets targeted so frequently, and Rhonda explains that they used to have regular night patrols when they belonged to a different county. Since becoming part of the Ferdio March, the kingdom has completely abandoned them because the small village produces barely any tax revenue. Van acknowledges the brutal reality of the kingdom's flawed laws, but assures the villagers that he will do everything in his power to defend and develop their home. The villagers remain highly skeptical, doubting that an 8-year-old boy can actually protect them from future raids. Seeing their hesitation, Esparta and Dee step forward and reveal their former high-ranking titles as the head butler and deputy commander of the Marquis' chivalric order. The villagers are instantly awestruck, realizing that Van has the backing of incredibly powerful figures. A villager asks if Van can use powerful elemental magic to protect them. Van honestly admits that he only has an aptitude for production magic, which causes the villagers to visibly slump in disappointment. However, the mood shifts drastically when a villager nervously brings up the crushing burden of their taxes. Van casually announces that he is lowering their taxes from 30% of their harvest down to a mere 10%. The villagers erupt into cheers, shedding tears of relief and praising their new lord's immense generosity. Getting straight to work, Van discusses a new defense strategy with Esparta and Dee. He wants to build a sturdy moat and set up pitfalls, but as a temporary measure, he asks Esparta to create another dirt wall around the settlement. Esparta happily complies, slamming his glowing hands into the ground to instantly raise a massive stone wall reinforced with sharpened wooden logs. The villagers watch in pure amazement as their defenseless home is instantly transformed into a fortified stronghold. Later that afternoon, Van decides to test the limits of his production magic in a nearby forest clearing. He picks up a wooden log and focuses his mana, visualizing the wood fibers separating and weaving together like ultra-dense nanofiber thread. The log glows intensely and transforms into a perfect, rainbow-colored cube. He repeats the process until he has a massive pile of these mysterious blocks. Till, Kamsin, and the adventurers gather around to inspect his creation. Ortho picks up one of the blocks, noting that it is surprisingly light. He asks for permission to test its durability and swings his sword at the block with enough force to cut through solid stone. The blade completely bounces off, leaving the rainbow block without a single scratch. Everyone is stunned by the material's incredible hardness, and Van realizes these fiber blocks could be extremely useful. As the sun begins to set, Van sits amidst a huge pile of weapons he just created using the blocks. Till expresses concern that he might be exhausting his mana reserves, as production magic usually drains a person completely after making just one item. Van casually replies that he doesn't feel tired at all, realizing his mana capacity is absurdly high. He picks up a beautifully crafted katana with a blue-wrapped hilt and a gold guard, offering it to Kamsin. The young boy accepts the blade with trembling excitement, promising to treasure it forever. Van then hands Till a massive, terrifying double-headed battle axe decorated with a large skull. Till forces a stiff smile and awkwardly thanks him, clearly terrified of the brutal weapon. Van notices her hesitation and makes a mental note to craft her a cute accessory later to make up for it. That night, Van sits by the campfire and watches Till and Kamsin sleep on the hard ground. He realizes they are completely exhausted from camping outdoors for weeks and haven't even been able to bathe properly. Determined to secure their basic needs before focusing entirely on the village's defenses, Van decides to build them a proper home. The next morning, he approaches Rhonda and asks for permission to build his house in an abandoned public square in the center of the village. Rhonda happily agrees, stating it is the perfect spot for the Lord's mansion. Van kneels on the grass, touches the dirt, and channels his magic into the massive stack of fiber blocks he created the day before. Glowing turquoise lines rapidly spread across the ground, forming a massive architectural grid. Thick pillars shoot up from the earth, rapidly connecting with walls, floors, and windows as the building actively constructs itself. The swirling white mist finally clears to reveal a gargantuan, multi-story white mansion complete with a red roof, a clock tower, and intricate detailing. The villagers, adventurers, and Van's companions all stare up at the massive structure in absolute shock, unable to comprehend how he built an entire mansion in a matter of seconds. Van just smiles to himself, deeply satisfied with his work, though he quietly admits that he might have made the house a little bit too big for just the three of them. The crowd stares at the newly constructed mansion in absolute awe. Esparta notes that Van's production magic is perfect for governing a territory and improving the people's lives. Dee argues that offensive magic is still better for making people feel secure. However, the villagers quickly disagree. They state they would much rather live in Van's town than under his father's rule. Van simply laughs and claims they are being too biased. He tells the group that if they bring him enough lumber, he can build houses for all of them. Hearing this, Ortho completely loses his mind. He aggressively shouts at his adventurer team to start gathering lumber immediately. He yells that they cannot afford to lose to the knights. The adventurers rush off in a frenzy to collect wood. Rhonda approaches Van and nervously asks if he can fix the village's current homes. He explains that their roofs leak, their floors are giving out, and the doors are rotting away. Van realizes that fixing all the broken houses individually would wear him out quickly. Instead, he decides to completely renovate the entire village from scratch to dramatically improve their living conditions. He announces his plan to build brand new homes for everyone. The villagers cheer in overwhelming joy, and Dee enthusiastically volunteers to fetch the necessary lumber. With the materials ready, Van uses his magic to reconstruct the village in a flash. He builds identical houses with stone foundations, wooden walls, chimneys, and brown shutters. He arranges them in a neat grid pattern, using a 4-home block as the fundamental unit with large streets running between them. He specifically makes the homes uniform to avoid creating any inequality among the villagers. He promises to upgrade each home individually to suit the residents once they manage to gather more stone. The villagers offer Van baskets of fresh vegetables, purple onions, and grain as a token of their deep gratitude. To add to the village's comfort, Van also constructs a simple public bathhouse next to his new manor. Pluriel uses her water magic to fill the large wooden tub, and Kamsin heats it from below with a charcoal fire, creating a Goemon-style bath. Till and Pluriel decide to take a bath together in the steaming green water. Pluriel expresses her shock that a noble like Van is kind enough to share such a luxury with commoners. Till passionately agrees and starts listing all of Van's amazing qualities. She brags about how he excelled in his studies and constantly defeated older boy soldiers in sword practice when he was just a toddler. She notes that his boundless knowledge is on par with most adults. Meanwhile, Kamsin bathes with Dee and the other men. Kamsin points out how muscular Dee has become. Dee laughs and suggests they deepen their friendship by being naked together, claiming it warms the heart and body. Kamsin quickly tries to leave the bath, but Dee grabs his shoulders and forces him to stay. Kamsin proudly states that he wants to become as strong as D so he can protect Van. Later that night, Van finally gets to sleep in a real bed in his new room. He feels incredibly content and falls asleep under the fluffy blue covers. The next day, Van inspects the large dirt wall surrounding the village. He tells his group that the defenses would be much better if they turned the trench into a water-filled moat. This would also provide the village with a steady supply of drinking and bath water. Esparta immediately gets to work. He uses his earth magic to instantly carve out a massive trench running several dozen meters from a nearby river. D, Kamsin, and the others follow behind, manually digging the trench deeper with shovels and wooden hose. Van trails behind them, using his magic to turn the dirt walls into solid stone to prevent the trench from collapsing. D completely throws himself into the manual labor. He swings his hoe with ridiculous enthusiasm and laughs maniacally while sending huge clumps of dirt into the air. Van watches him in utter confusion and wonders what could possibly be so fun about digging a ditch. Esparta simply notes that D is incredibly spry for a 40-year-old man. The group works tirelessly, but D wants to push through the night. He claims he just found a great new way to train his body. Esparta forces him to stop, pointing out that Kamsin and the other workers are completely exhausted and shivering from the intense labor. After a day and a half of hard work, the canal is finally finished. Van gives the order to open the gate, and a rush of blue water flows through the stone trench. The villagers celebrate as the water quickly fills the moat around the settlement. Esparta suggests creating a reservoir lake behind the village to store water for potential droughts or floods. Van agrees, and they successfully form a large sparkling lake near the forest. Rhonda and the villagers thank Van profusely for giving them reliable access to water without having to trek all the way to the river. Elsewhere, Panamera rides in a dimly lit carriage alongside her companion Arte. Arte rests her head on Panamera's lap and calls her dashing. Panamera playfully scolds the girl, insisting that she is as beautiful as a goddess. She tells Arte to get some rest, since they still have a long journey ahead of them to reach the remote village. Back at the village, Van continues to upgrade the defenses. He mixes stone into the earthen walls to make them as sturdy as concrete. He also mounts several large ballistae along the top of the walls. He equips the ballistae with metal shields so the defenders can fire heavy bolts while remaining protected from enemy attacks. Ortho and his team are highly impressed by the massive weapons. They note that the small village now looks like a legitimate fortress city and mere bandits will never conquer it. D proudly states that Van's power is more than enough to rival the Marquis. Esparta cautions D against suggesting a rebellion, but D insists that Van will eventually make a massive comeback. Van simply smiles and ignores the dramatic talk, stating that they all have to make do and fight with what they have. Later, the group sits down for dinner in the new manor. Till serves a delicious meal consisting of an omelet, vegetables, and ham. However, she apologizes for the lack of ingredients. She mentions that they have no seasonings or the supplies needed to make Van's favorite sweet-baked desserts. Van is absolutely devastated by the lack of sweets. He realizes that the village needs a reliable source of income to attract merchants. He asks the group for ideas on what they can produce and sell to create an industry. Till suggests selling the indestructible fiber blocks Van creates, but Van rejects the idea since only he can make them. Kamsin suggests hunting monsters, but Van points out that only Ortho's team is skilled enough to do that safely. Van decides he needs to think of a better plan to establish a local product. The next day, Van checks on his friend's weapon training. He previously gifted Kamsin a sword, and Till a massive battle axe decorated with a skull. However, both of them refuse to use the weapons because they don't want to damage Van's gifts. Van insists that they need to practice so they can defend themselves in an emergency. To demonstrate, the blonde adventurer offers to let Kamsin strike his prized Orc Knight shield. The man boasts that the shield is made from tough monster hide and can easily withstand a light hit. Kamsin swings his wooden training sword, and to everyone's absolute shock, the wooden blade easily slices the shield perfectly in half. The blonde adventurer bursts into hysterical tears over his ruined equipment. Van quickly steps in and uses his magic to seamlessly repair the broken shield. The blonde man enthusiastically cheers as his gear is restored. Just then, Ortho and his team return to the village pulling a large wooden cart filled with rare ores. Ortho explains that they gathered the materials from the deep forest at the foot of the Wolfspurred Mountain. He shows Van chunks of copper, silver, iron, gold, and even a massive glowing blue crystal of mithril. He explains that the area is swarming with strong monsters, which is why the ores have never been mined before. Van is thrilled by the discovery and asks to use some of the iron ore. The blonde adventurer begs Van to forge him a sword to replace his repaired shield. Van agrees and focuses his magic on a chunk of iron ore. He transforms the raw metal into a glowing blue liquid, packing it firmly to ensure a thick ridge and a sharp edge. He shapes it into a beautifully ornate short sword and a sleek silver long sword. The adventurers are completely blown away by the incredible craftsmanship. They all swarm Van and eagerly beg him to make custom weapons for them too. Van happily agrees to make weapons for all the adventurers free of charge since they brought him the valuable ores. Pluriel inspects the swords and assures Van that he could sell his forged weapons for a massive profit. Esparta then examines the mithril crystal and points out a serious problem. He explains that finding mithril in a forest rather than a mountain means there is likely an undiscovered dungeon nearby. Van realizes that a new dungeon would bring hordes of adventurers, merchants, and knights to their village. However, Esparta warns that the village currently lacks the food and infrastructure to support a massive influx of people. Worse yet, the neighboring Ferdinando County would likely attack them to steal the dungeon's resources. Furthermore, if Van's father learns about the valuable land, he will definitely exile Van somewhere else and take over the territory. Pluriel suggests that they completely avoid the area and pretend the dungeon doesn't exist. Van agrees that they must keep the discovery a total secret. He plans to quietly grow the village's strength and produce solid results before officially reporting the dungeon to the guild. A few days later, Van and Till walk through the newly paved streets. Van feels satisfied with the housing renovations and decides to stop using his magic for the day since he is starting to feel tired. Suddenly, a villager spots a massive dust cloud quickly approaching from the main road. The man screams in terror and warns everyone that a pack of armored lizards is charging straight toward the village. The giant green-scaled monsters sprint aggressively down the dirt path, kicking up a huge amount of dust. Van immediately orders the guards to raise the drawbridge and secure the heavy wooden gates. The villagers frantically run inside the fortress walls just as the monsters reach the perimeter. The giant lizards begin violently bashing against the thick stone walls. Inside the fortress, the villagers huddle together in absolute terror. They peer through the narrow wooden slits and sweat profusely as the monsters continuously slam into the barricades. Seeing the sheer panic on their faces, Van steps forward and addresses the entire crowd. He acknowledges that they are all terrified of the battle and afraid of getting injured. However, he reminds them that the lives of everyone in the village depend on this fight. He vows to step onto the battlefield and fight for their safety, but he admits that he cannot protect everyone with his strength alone. He passionately begs the villagers to lend him their strength so they can all protect their home together. The villagers hear Van's plea and immediately agree to fight alongside him to protect their newly built home. They all rush out of the shelter and quickly take their positions on the ramparts, showing absolutely no hesitation in the face of the approaching monsters. Van commands Dee to load the newly constructed ballistae with the heavy iron bolts. Dee is a veteran knight who usually relies on his own brute strength and combat experience to win battles, but he decides to put his full trust in Van's defensive strategy for this fight. He shouts orders to the village defenders, and they swiftly push the massive mechanical crossbows into position. Out in the dusty wasteland, the first wave of giant armored lizards charges aggressively toward the fortress. These massive green-scaled serpents are incredibly tough, and the defenders know that normal weapons will simply bounce right off their steel-like armor. Dee gives the order to fire, and the villagers pull the levers. Massive iron bolts shoot through the air and completely pierce the giant lizards, dropping 10 of them instantly. The villagers cheer in absolute shock, completely amazed by the sheer destructive power of Van's siege weapon. However, Dee quickly realizes a major problem. They only have a few iron bolts left, and a second wave of monsters is already approaching fast through the thick dust. He orders everyone to reload, and they fire the remaining iron bolts. The barrage successfully wipes out the second wave, leaving several more giant carcasses scattered across the rocky ground. But now the defenders are completely out of iron ammunition. Things take a dire turn when a massive third wave consisting of 40 armored lizards suddenly appears on the horizon. The monsters roar and charge together, kicking up a huge sandstorm. Dee starts to panic because the village seems defenseless without the iron bolts, and the approaching monsters can easily flatten the walls. Van calmly assesses the situation and orders Dee to load the ballistae with wooden bolts instead. Dee's knights immediately argue against the idea. They point out that simple wood will completely shatter against the monster's thick armor and do zero damage. However, Dee remembers how Van has constantly defied expectations by rapidly developing the village and creating indestructible materials out of thin air. He decides to put his absolute faith in his young lord and loudly orders his men to use the wooden bolts. They quickly load the weapons and fire a massive volley into the sky. To everyone's absolute amazement, the wooden projectiles easily pierce straight through the armored lizards' heads just as effectively as the iron ones did. They successfully slaughter all 40 monsters, leaving the wasteland littered with green carcasses. The villagers celebrate wildly, completely overjoyed that they managed to wipe out an entire horde of terrifying monsters without a single person getting injured. After the battle, the villagers head out to the dusty plain to harvest the valuable materials from the fallen lizards. They work efficiently to preserve the eyes, fangs, and magic cores while discarding the useless guts. Ortho watches the process and points out that butchering these creatures normally takes forever, often causing the meat to spoil before the job is even done. However, he notes that thanks to the ultra-sharp knives Van forged for them, the workers easily slice through the thick green scales and finish the harvest in record time. To celebrate their flawless victory, Van decides to throw a massive feast for the entire village. They gather under the night sky and roast mountains of high-quality marbled lizard meat over open fires. The villagers drink alcohol, eat skewers of meat, and laugh together, overjoyed to finally have a safe and prosperous home. One old man expresses his surprise that a noble like Van is actually willing to join in the revelry with commoners. Esparta quietly notes that such behavior is highly inappropriate for a noble, but the villagers simply view it as part of Van's unique charm. During the lively festival, the adventurers completely rave about the custom weapons Van made for them. Pluriel shows off her magical staff, Ortho praises his durable gear, and the blonde adventurer excitedly swings his new sword, claiming it slices right through monster bones without any resistance. Seeing the incredible quality of the equipment, Dee and his knights eagerly surround Van and ask him to forge greatswords and longswords for them as well. Van feels a bit overwhelmed by the sudden demands, but promises to make them new gear once the village's finances and materials are fully sorted out. Later in the evening, Van sits down near a campfire with Esparta, Pluriel, and Ortho to calculate the financial value of their massive hunt. They have 40 armored lizard carcasses in total. Pluriel estimates that each lizard is normally worth 20 gold coins. Even after subtracting the transport fees and the cost of the meat that will inevitably spoil, they can easily sell each one for 8 gold coins. That totals over 300 gold coins. Van quickly does the math in his head and realizes this is equivalent to roughly 300 million yen in his past life. He is absolutely ecstatic about securing such immense wealth. However, Esparta quickly ruins the mood by explaining the duchy's strict tax laws. He states that any village earning over 100 gold coins must pay 50% of it directly to the local marquis, who happens to be Van's father. Van immediately panics at this revelation. He knows that if his cruel father finds out this remote, supposedly worthless village is actually highly profitable, he will definitely swoop in to steal the wealth. Worse yet, his father might exile Van to an even more dangerous location, completely ruining his dream of living a peaceful, easy life. Esparta suggests a clever loophole to avoid the taxes. He proposes that they officially report the monster hunt under the name of Van's older brother, Mercia. Mercia desperately wants military achievements to boost his reputation, so he will gladly take the credit for the victory. This arrangement works perfectly for both sides, allowing Van's village to keep the money hidden from their greedy father. The next morning, 2 traveling merchants named Bert and Rango arrive at the village in a horse-drawn wagon. They belong to the Merry Chamber of Commerce. The brothers are completely shocked to find a massive, pristine white fortress standing exactly where a rundown village is supposed to be. They are even more surprised when Van greets them from the walls and introduces himself as the lord of the village. They recognize him as Marquis Fertio's legendary prodigy son and cannot believe he is running this remote outpost. Van welcomes the merchants inside the stone fortress and leads them to a massive storage room. He shows them the towering stacks of sacks filled with armored lizard materials. Bert and Rango are completely dumbfounded that a tiny village managed to take down a massive horde of monsters that even seasoned adventurers fear. They eagerly agree to buy the entire stock, but explain it will take them about a month to gather enough men and carts to transport everything. Van agrees to the timeline and generously offers them some of the excess meat for free. Trying to secure a secondary trade deal, the merchants offer to sell Van their inventory of high-quality weapons. In response, Van brings out the weapons he forged himself and displays them on the grass. The merchants inspect the glowing swords and axes, instantly realizing they are masterfully crafted and far superior to their own goods. They immediately offer to buy Van's weapons at his asking price and ask if they can promote them on their trade routes. Van quickly figures out their true intentions. He realizes the brothers want to monopolize his weapons and sell them across the region for a massive profit. He points out that if 2 merchants traveling the exact same route suddenly start selling legendary weapons, other nobles and merchants will quickly trace the source back to this village. This would attract unwanted attention and completely ruin Van's secret operation. Instead of letting them leave with the goods, Van proposes a completely different idea. He tells the brothers to set up a permanent shop right inside the village. This way, they can control the flow of goods without drawing direct attention to the trade routes. The merchants are extremely hesitant about running a shop in such a remote area, but before they can even argue, Van uses his production magic to instantly construct a beautiful two-story commercial building right in front of them. He even adds a red banner and fish-shaped window panels to complete the look. Bert and Rango are utterly flabbergasted by the sudden manifestation of a perfect storefront. Realizing the massive potential of working with a lord who can literally build infrastructure out of thin air, they happily agree to the deal and look forward to doing business together. Sometime later, Van sits in his comfortable study with Esparta, mapping out the village's future development. Van plans to expand the settlement into a massive star-shaped fortress city capable of holding 10,000 people. He explains that a star shape provides overlapping fields of fire, making it incredibly difficult for an invading army to breach the walls without getting attacked from multiple angles. Suddenly, a knight bursts through the doors to announce that an emissary from the neighboring Fortunato County has arrived. Van immediately heads to the reception room to meet the guest. He is introduced to Viscountess Panamera, a tall blonde woman with a facial scar and a golden eye marking, who recently rose from the rank of knight. Sitting nervously beside her is Arte, the young, silver-haired youngest daughter of Count Fortunato. Panamera gets straight to business. She tells Van that Count Fortunato is highly suspicious of the village's sudden and rapid development. The Count assumes Van was sent here as a military vanguard to help Marquis Fertio launch an invasion into the neighboring kingdom. Van firmly denies the accusation. He explains that he was simply exiled by his father because he completely lacks any aptitude for elemental magic. Panamera refuses to believe his story. She points out that Van turned a rundown hamlet into an impenetrable fortress in a matter of weeks. She assumes he secretly brought at least 5,000 soldiers and mages with him to pull off such a massive construction project. Hearing this ridiculous theory, Van bursts into uncontrollable laughter. He apologizes for his outburst and clarifies that his father only let him bring his personal maid and his young slave. Panamera demands to know how he has a veteran butler and a seasoned knight commander working for him. Esparta explains that he voluntarily retired to follow Van, and D states that he abandoned his post in the chivalric order simply because he deeply respects Van's leadership. Panamera is still highly skeptical about how the massive walls and houses were built without an army of workers. To settle the debate once and for all, Van takes Panamera and Arte outside to a grassy clearing near the mountain. He raises his hand, channels his mana, and instantly pulls a massive, towering earthen wall straight out of the ground. He then changes the material into solid white stone and perfectly forms a giant wooden gate. Panamera and Arte stare at the massive structure in absolute shock. They finally realize that Van is not an elemental mage, but an incredibly rare top-tier production mage. Arte feels deeply sympathetic because she knows production magic is heavily looked down upon by society. She realizes Van was genuinely disowned just for having the wrong type of magic. Panamera drops her stern demeanor and reveals the real reason they came to the village. Count Fortunato sent them to explicitly offer Arte's hand in marriage to Van. It is essentially a political move to dump his daughter on a remote lord and avoid any border conflicts. Panamera admits that she originally planned to sabotage the engagement. She assumed Van was just a spoiled, useless child and didn't want Arte to suffer in a poor, dangerous wasteland. However, after seeing Van's incredible magical power, his mature foresight, and the immense loyalty he inspires in his followers, Panamera changes her mind completely. She strongly encourages the marriage, claiming Van is the most capable man she has ever met. She even jokes that she would marry him herself if she weren't so much older. Both Van and Arte become extremely flustered by the sudden marriage push. Van awkwardly states that they are far too young to rush into an engagement and suggests they take their time to think it over. Panamera agrees and decides they will spend the night in the village so Arte can gather her thoughts. Arte is absolutely terrified at the idea of sleeping in the same building as a boy she just met. To respect her boundaries, Van uses his magic to instantly construct a fully furnished, two-story guest inn specifically for them. Panamera is once again blown away by his incredible building speed. That evening, Van hosts a grand dinner for his guests in the new manor. They eat high-quality steaks and vegetables. Van tries to make polite conversation and asks Arte about her hobbies. Arte shyly admits that she loves cute things, especially flowers and dolls. She mentions she brought some dolls in her carriage and offers to show them to Van tomorrow. Thompson and Till eagerly ask if they can see the dolls too. Arte is overjoyed that other people are actually interested in her hobbies and happily agrees. Later that night, Panamera heads inside, leaving Van and Arte alone outside the inn. Arte nervously thanks Van for his wonderful hospitality. She admits she was incredibly anxious about the arranged marriage but is deeply relieved to discover he is such a kind and accommodating person. She blushes heavily, bids him goodnight, and runs inside the building. Van watches her leave, feeling glad that he managed to make a good impression. He regroups with Esparta, Dee, Kamsin, and Till in his study to discuss the situation. Van deduces that since Count Ferdinando was so quick to use his daughter as a political pawn, Arte probably lacks elemental magic as well. He realizes she was essentially thrown away by her family, just like he was. Because he completely understands her pain, Van resolves to prioritize Arte's happiness above all else. He decides that she can choose to live in his village permanently, regardless of whether they get engaged or not, or she can easily return home if that is what she truly wants. Meanwhile, inside the guest inn, Panamera teases Arte, asking if she already confessed her love to Van. Arte frantically denies it, her face turning completely red. Panamera suggests they extend their stay by a few more days instead of leaving in the morning, and Arte eagerly agrees to the idea. As Arte lies in bed that night, she thinks about the kind, silver-haired boy. She decides to try initiating a conversation with him the next day. For the first time in a long while, she closes her eyes with a genuine smile, actually looking forward to waking up in the morning. Early the next morning, Till rushes into Van's bedroom with Kamsin right behind her to wake him up from a deep sleep. She frantically tells him that it is an absolute emergency, and that Dee and Esparta are already hurrying to the newly formed lake behind the village. Van gets out of bed and asks what is going on, only to learn that the villagers have officially named the body of water Lake Van to honor his great deeds. Till also mentions that they are planning to name the entire settlement Van Village, which completely embarrasses Van and makes him immediately beg them to stop using those names. They head outside and meet up with Dee and Esparta at the grassy edge of the lake, where a massive crowd of villagers has already gathered to see what the commotion is all about. Esparta points toward the water and explains that a very rare species of half-human, half-fish creatures, called the apkalu, have inexplicably taken up residence in the lake. Suddenly, a young tan-skinned mermaid with long blue hair and fin-like headpieces surfaces from the clear water and stares at the crowd. Van tries to be friendly and asks the mermaid if she can understand him or if she needs anything, but she just silently watches them. Hoping that offering food will establish a peaceful relationship, Van asks Till and Kamsin to fetch some meat. A few moments later, Van crouches by the water and holds out a plate with a freshly grilled skewer of armored lizard meat. The mermaid cautiously approaches, asks if she is allowed to eat it, and then takes a large bite. Her eyes immediately go wide with sheer amazement at the delicious flavor, and Van promises to make her some jerky if she wants more tomorrow. The mermaid asks who managed to defeat the terrifying armored lizards, and before Van can humbly downplay his role, Esparta, Dee, and the entire crowd of villagers proudly shout that Lord Van defeated the monsters with his incredible strength. The mermaid takes this information in and quietly dives back into the lake, leaving everyone wondering if she will ever return. The very next day, Van returns to the lake and is completely shocked to find several apkalu swimming near the surface. The mermaid from the previous day is there, accompanied by her father, a muscular merman wearing a golden crown and jewelry named Lada Vesta. Lada Vesta formally thanks Van for showing kindness to his daughter, Lada Priora, and then absolutely stuns everyone by offering his daughter's hand in marriage to Van. Van instantly panics and refuses the sudden proposal, but Lada Vesta explains that armored lizards have been invading their natural rivers and killing many of their people, forcing them to seek an alliance with a powerful human who can protect them. Understanding their desperate situation, Van assures Lada Vesta that the marriage arrangement is completely unnecessary and promises to protect their tribe regardless, allowing them to live safely in his lake. Lada Vesta is deeply moved by Van's genuine kindness and officially declares that his people will settle there permanently. To make them feel welcome, Van uses his production magic to instantly build a massive, sunlit wooden bathhouse right on the edge of the water so everyone can relax safely indoors regardless of the weather. Lada Vesta is absolutely blown away by Van's magical abilities and asks if there is anything his people can do to repay the favor. Van mentions that he installed sewage pipes directly underneath the village buildings and that they need to regularly open heavy metal gates to flush the waste out into the ocean to keep the town sanitary. Lada Vesta immediately offers to take over the sewage management, explaining that the apkalu excel at underwater tasks. Kamsin demonstrates how to open the heavy vertical gates, and Lada Vesta's men easily dive down to handle the daily maintenance, proving to be a huge help to the village. Later that day, Panamera and Arte arrive near the lake and are completely shocked to see the legendary apkalu swimming around. The situation quickly becomes incredibly awkward when Lotta Vesta casually addresses Van as his son-in-law and Lotta Priora cheerfully calls him her husband. Panamera and Arte freeze in absolute disbelief, assuming Van secretly married a mermaid behind their backs. While Van hangs his head in defeat and frantically tries to explain the cultural misunderstanding, wanting to properly clear the air, Van invites Arte out on a small wooden boat the next morning to enjoy the fresh air and talk things over privately. Arte apologizes for jumping to conclusions, and Van apologizes for causing the confusion, bringing them both a sense of relief. Arte then praises Van for his incredible work developing the village, but their peaceful moment is suddenly interrupted when Lotta Priora pops out of the water right next to the boat and happily greets Van as her husband. Startled by the sudden appearance of the mermaid, Arte introduces herself, prompting Lotta Priora to jokingly call Van the Meat Man. Several other Apkallu suddenly surface around the boat and excitedly greet their new lord, but their energetic splashing accidentally causes Arte to fall out of the boat and straight into the deep water. Van quickly pulls the soaked Arte back into the boat while Lotta Priora pouts, feeling slightly jealous of the other girl. The Apkallu completely ignore Van's protest that he is not actually engaged to Lotta Priora and begin violently rocking the small wooden boat, demanding more lizard meat. Terrified of capsizing, Van immediately promises to give them all the meat they want if they just stop, which makes the mermaids cheer victoriously. From the shore, Lotta Vesta observes the entire chaotic scene and sternly accuses Van of flirting with another woman while he is already promised to his daughter. To settle the matter, Lotta Vesta challenges Van to a massive 3-round sports competition, declaring that if the Apkallu win, Van must officially recognize the betrothal to Lotta Priora. Before Van can even try to decline, Dee steps forward and loudly accepts the challenge on behalf of the village, and Esparta agrees, believing that a swift victory will let Van focus on his studies. Van is forced to participate and is given the right to choose the very first event. He decides on water volleyball and quickly sets up a net across the bathhouse pool, using a yellow and green ball. Panamera and Arte eagerly team up to represent the humans, with Panamera looking stunning in a black bikini and completely determined to win, so Van can eventually marry Arte instead. The match begins with intense energy as Lotta Vesta launches powerful, glowing spikes over the net, trying to crush the human team instantly. Panamera and Arte refuse to give up, diving into the water to keep the ball in play. Panamera uses her incredible agility to slide across the surface of the water and deliver a massive spike of her own, successfully scoring the final point and winning the first round for Van's team. However, Lotta Vesta refuses to back down and chooses a swimming relay for the second round. Van is terrified because the Apkallu are naturally aquatic creatures, but Kamsen and Dee confidently volunteer to race. The race starts in the open ocean, and Kamsen swims against Lotta Priora, managing to keep up with her impressive speed through sheer determination. When it is time to switch swimmers, Dee dives off the raft and unleashes an aggressive butterfly stroke. His massive muscles propel him through the water like a torpedo, allowing him to easily overtake Lotta Vesta and win the race for the humans. Even though Van's team has technically already secured the overall victory, the competition moves to a third round, which Van decides will be a shaved ice speed eating contest. Van asks Pluriel to use her ice magic, and he grinds massive blocks of ice using a manual machine, covering the bowls in colorful syrups. Van and Arte sit on a bench and face off against Lotta Vesta and Lotta Priora in a brutal test of endurance. Everyone quickly shovels the freezing ice into their mouths and suffers from agonizing brain freeze. Lotta Vesta fights through the pain for the sake of his daughter, but Van and Arte push themselves even harder and ultimately finish their bowls first, winning the final round. Lotta Vesta graciously accepts defeat and shakes hands with Dee, but the victory is completely hollowed out when Lotta Vesta announces that Van's passionate display only proves he is even more worthy of his daughter. Lotta Vesta continues to call him his son-in-law and tells him to take good care of Lotta Priora, leaving Van and Arte standing there with their mouths open in pure shock as they realize the entire competition changed absolutely nothing. Exhausted from the events, Van suddenly gets a terrible stomachache from eating way too much shaved ice, causing Panamera, Dee, and the others to burst into laughter at his misery. Arte watches Van surrounded by all his loyal friends and reflects on her own incredibly painful past. She remembers how her mother completely despised her because she only possessed marionette magic, an ability considered inherently evil and useless by high society. Her mother screamed at her for practicing it, and after that day, her entire family ignored her existence until her father abruptly arranged her engagement just to get rid of her. However, seeing how Van uses his own supposedly useless production magic to build a thriving community and bring genuine joy to everyone around him completely changes her perspective. She feels deeply inspired by his unwavering confidence and quietly resolves to stop giving up on her own abilities. The very next day, Van stands on a wooden platform and addresses the village workers, promising them a massive barbecue feast that night if they work hard to build more defensive ramparts. The villagers cheer enthusiastically, highly motivated by the promise of good food. Arte approaches Van in her beautiful pink dress, looking more energized and hopeful than she ever has before. She tells Van that she wants to see the world from his unique perspective and asks if she can shadow him while he works. Van happily agrees to let her watch, glad to see her in such high spirits. Meanwhile, far away from the peaceful village, the scene shifts to a barren, cracked wasteland where three panicked men sprint desperately for their lives. A man with short ash-blonde hair, wearing a white cape and carrying a massive silver shield on his back, frantically looks over his shoulder. He screams loudly for his boss as the trio flees from a terrifying, unseen threat that is rapidly hunting them down across the desolate dirt field. Panamera admires the newly built ramparts surrounding the village, completely shocked that Van and his people managed to construct such sturdy defenses in only 2 weeks. She admits she is incredibly envious of his success and hopes to earn her own land someday through military glory. Van casually mentions that he expects more merchants and adventurers to move in soon, so they will need to build even more houses to accommodate the growing population. Panamera then notices the massive gray ballistae mounted on top of the stone walls and asks about them. Van explains that he designed them to be much larger than his previous models, with the special ability to fire 2 bolts in rapid succession. To demonstrate their destructive power, Van asks Kamsin to test one out. Kamsin climbs up to the ballista, pulls the heavy lever, and launches 3 massive bolts high into the air. The projectiles soar across the sky and strike a distant mountain, triggering massive explosions that leave Panamera and Arte completely stunned. Van proudly states that he has over 100 of these ballistae lined up along the ramparts. Hearing this, Panamera immediately asks to buy one, but Van politely declines, explaining that his defensive weapons are not for sale. However, since they are on good terms, he agrees to give her one as a special favor that he intends to call in later. Panamera gratefully accepts the gift and promises to arrange a carriage for transportation, mentioning that she can simply craft her own iron bolts back at her estate. Kamsin steps in and strongly advises her to take at least one of Van's specially crafted bolts instead. To prove his point, Kamsin asks Panamera if she has a spare sword she does not mind breaking. Panamera confidently hands over her reliable backup blade, highly doubting that a child could possibly damage a weapon that has survived countless battles. Kamsin draws his own jagged black sword and strikes her blade, slicing it cleanly in half with almost no effort. Panamera is absolutely shocked by the weapon's incredible cutting power and lack of impact force. She asks what rare material the sword is made from, and Van casually replies that it is just ordinary iron. Realizing that Van uses his unique production magic to drastically enhance the base iron's strength, Panamera immediately asks for a supply of his specialized ballista bolts to go with her new weapon. Van happily agrees to the deal. Suddenly, a panicked shout interrupts their conversation. Ortho and his party of adventurers come sprinting across the barren wasteland toward the village, desperately fleeing from a colossal forest dragon that bursts from the ground right behind them. The massive green armored beast roars aggressively as it chases the terrified men. Ortho bravely yells for his fastest runner to head straight to the village and warn everyone while the rest of his team distracts the monster to buy them time. Van realizes that Ortho's party is planning to sacrifice themselves and he refuses to let that happen. Even though fighting the beast could endanger the entire village, Van decides they have to make a stand right there. Panamera immediately offers her assistance, noting that it is only a matter of time before the dragon reaches the settlement anyway. Since the forest dragon is a mid-class monster that lacks a breath attack, they have a solid chance of taking it down using the enhanced ballistae. Van orders his maid, Till, to escort Arte back to the absolute safety of the village and instructs her to quickly summon D and his knights to the front lines. With the non-combatants cleared out, Van commands the guards on the wall to ready the ballistae, specifically warning them not to accidentally hit Ortho's fleeing party. He plans to ground the flying beast first by aiming directly for its wings. Out on the battlefield, Varys trips and falls hard onto the rocky ground, screaming for his friends to leave him behind. Van quickly rushes into the danger zone, drawing his enhanced sword to protect the fallen adventurer. The dragon swoops down, but the first volley of ballista bolts completely misses the agile creature. Panamera realizes they need to halt its rapid movement, so she steps forward to intercept it. Using her top-class elemental magic, she summons a massive vortex of fire and unleashes a devastating spell called Fire Javelin. The blazing orb of magical energy slams directly into the ground near the dragon, creating a blinding explosion that turns the sky red. While the blast is incredibly powerful, the dragon simply emerges from the molten debris, completely enraged but largely unharmed. The creature unfurls its wings and takes to the sky again. Van seizes the brief opening and orders every ballista to fire a second volley. This time, the massive bolts tear straight through the dragon's wings, leaving gaping holes in the membrane and forcing the beast to crash violently into the stone courtyard. Thinking they have the upper hand, Van orders another full volley, but the dragon quickly anticipates the attack. It rapidly glides across the ground, dodging the incoming projectiles, and swings its massive tail to smash the surrounding area. The defenders barely manage to evade the crushing blow. Realizing the dragon is too resilient for standard attacks, Panamera uses her magic to create a glowing barrier to block the monster's advance, but the beast easily deflects her efforts. She quickly decides to fall back to a safer position so she can prepare a much stronger interception spell. The furious dragon crashes straight through the fortress walls, sending huge chunks of stone flying everywhere. Esparta immediately steps in front of the beast to buy everyone some time. He sternly orders Van to run away, but Van completely refuses to abandon his loyal butler. Esparta insists that Van needs to take charge of the village's main defenses, promising to hold the line just long enough for them to escape. Esparta unleashes his magic, creating enough of a distraction to temporarily halt the dragon's rampage. Once Van and the exhausted adventurers safely retreat to a distance, Esparta falls back as well, jokingly complaining about how much running hurts his old bones. Van formulates a final plan and asks Panamera to use her ultimate magic to pin the dragon to the ground the exact moment it breaches the inner ramparts. He explains that if she can immobilize it, they can hit it with a concentrated barrage from every single ballista at once. Panamera agrees to the strategy, playfully demanding a huge share of the dragon meat as her reward. The dragon completely obliterates the remaining stone fortifications and charges forward. Just as things look dire, Dee and his squad of knights finally arrive from the village, fully equipped with the heavy silver armor and massive shields Van crafted for them. Dee confidently charges toward the beast, eager to test out his new gear. The dragon unleashes a devastating wave of energy, but Dee and his men firmly plant their golden shields in the dirt and successfully block the massive impact without taking a scratch. Following Esparta's tactical advice, the knights slowly retreat, carefully luring the massive beast right into Van's trap. Once the dragon is perfectly positioned in front of the walls, Van yells for Panamera to strike. She unleashes Flare Blast, a blindingly intense orb of orange and yellow fire that crashes down onto the dragon. The sheer force of the explosion shatters the ground and completely stuns the monster. Without missing a beat, Van screams for all the ballistae to fire. Dozens of heavy iron bolts rain down from the sky, piercing straight through the dragon's thick scales and securely pinning its massive body to the scorched earth. The beast tries to struggle, but it is completely trapped beneath the iron stakes. Dee seizes the perfect opportunity and casually walks up to the immobilized monster. As the dragon opens its jaws to let out a final roar, Dee ruthlessly drives his large sword straight down into its mouth, instantly killing the beast. Van watches the monster go limp and joyfully declares their absolute victory. The villagers and soldiers on the wall erupt into massive cheers, thrilled that they managed to survive such a terrifying ordeal. Panamera approaches Van to make sure he is unhurt, and Arte soon joins them, expressing her immense relief that everyone made it out alive. Panamera is genuinely amazed by the outcome, pointing out that a forest dragon of that size would have easily wiped most standard towns or fortress cities completely off the map. She praises Esparta for his incredible magical talent and commends Dee for delivering the flawless finishing blow. Above all, she is completely stunned that Van's custom ballistae actually possessed enough sheer kinetic force to pierce dragon scales. Van humbly accepts the praise but casually mentions that he needs to upgrade the weapon so they can fire 10 consecutive bolts next time, a terrifying engineering prospect that leaves Panamera speechless. Later that day, the entire village gathers in front of the newly constructed mansion for a grand dragon slaying ceremony. Panamera stands on the balcony beside Van and delivers a powerful speech to the massive crowd. She highlights the miracle that their small village not only survived the dragon attack, but did so without suffering a single casualty or major structural damage. She officially bestows the prestigious title of Dragon Slayer upon Dee for his heroic final strike. She then honors Esparta for his invaluable magical support that kept the monster contained. Finally, she turns the spotlight onto Van, praising his unmatched genius, quick decision-making, and incredible leadership. She emphasizes that his unique use of production magic is the only reason the village boasts such impenetrable defenses. The crowd goes wild, chanting Lord Van's name in pure admiration. As Panamera watches the villagers celebrate, she deeply reflects on her own difficult journey to the top of society. She remembers being born into a long line of knights and getting shipped off to a harsh county the moment her magical aptitude was discovered. She survived grueling, life-threatening training to become a squad commander at 16, fighting in countless brutal battles to eventually earn her title of Viscountess. She vividly recalls the day Count Ferdinando summoned her to arrange a marriage between his youngest daughter, Arte, and Van. Knowing that Arte was completely neglected and unwanted by her own family due to her supposedly useless marionette magic, Panamera had fully intended to reject the engagement and take Arte back home if Van turned out to be an incompetent fool. However, seeing how Van treats Arte completely changed her mind. She remembers watching Van and Arte happily eating shaved ice together, noting how Van's genuine kindness and unwavering confidence inspired the once timid girl to finally take initiative in her own life. Panamera realizes that Van is a truly extraordinary individual who brings out the best in everyone around him. Determined to align herself with such a promising young lord, she pulls Van aside into a quiet room and formally vows to forge an equal alliance with him. She promises to provide him with full political backing and guarantees that Count Ferdinando's knights will never dare to invade his territory as long as they are allies. Van quickly calculates the benefits, realizing that this partnership will completely secure his borders and bring massive financial opportunities to his growing town. He happily accepts her generous offer, and they shake hands, officially cementing a powerful new friendship that guarantees the future safety and prosperity of the village. Van sits in his office with Esparta, discussing the success of the new ramparts. Esparta suggests that since the defenses are solid, Van should focus on city planning next to attract new residents and reach their goal of a population of 10,000. Soon after, Bell and Rango return with two senior merchants from the Merry Chamber of Commerce to purchase the forest dragon materials. The group heads to the warehouse where the dragon's remains are stored. The older merchants inspect the massive white head and quietly realize the scales, claws, fangs, and eyes are all in perfect condition. They estimate the haul is worth at least 100 platinum coins, which equates to 10 billion yen. Van excitedly calculates the massive payout in his head, thrilled at hitting the jackpot. However, the older merchants quickly scheme to lowball Van. They tell him the market value is only 60 platinum coins. Assuming that since they are the only merchants visiting this remote village, Van has no choice but to accept. Van is severely disappointed by the low offer and considers turning them down. Bell and Rango immediately step in and argue with their superiors, insisting that as merchants they must offer a fair appraisal regardless of the seller's status. The older men aggressively threaten to kick the brothers out of the trading company if they ruin the scheme. Choosing integrity over their jobs, Bell and Rango refuse to back down, and the senior merchants storm out of the warehouse, warning them that they will regret this decision. Van suggests that Bell and Rango simply start their own trading company. The brothers explain that establishing a new firm requires paying a registration fee to the Merchant Guild, owning a physical shop, and most difficult of all, securing an endorsement from a titled noble. Van realizes he does not have a noble title yet, making him useless for the endorsement. Panamera steps into the room and confidently offers to endorse the brothers herself. Van worries that the royal-backed Merry Chamber of Commerce might retaliate against her, but Panamera assures him that as a newly elevated Viscountess, backing a small firm will not hurt her reputation. She notes that the royal family would actually look bad if they tried to interfere. Van realizes this is a great opportunity to gain influence without drawing negative attention to himself. He suggests Panamera take full credit for slaying the forest dragon to boost her status even further. Panamera rejects the idea, explaining that any royal investigation into the dragon's death would eventually lead right back to Van and expose the truth anyway. Instead, she advises Van to claim the glory himself and use the achievement to earn his own noble title. She explains that if Van becomes a baron, he can officially establish his own noble house, which would permanently prevent his father from summoning him back home. Van is totally terrified when Panamera casually mentions that she reduces her enemies to ash and jokes about eating him in 5 years, but he eventually agrees to her plan. With Panamera's official endorsement secured, Bell and Rango are thrilled to finally start their own company. Van eagerly sells the dragon materials to the brothers for a fair price of 130 platinum coins. The group plans to transport the dragon materials to the royal capital, but they quickly discover that the senior merchants took all the available carriages when they left. The older men intentionally stranded them, expecting Belle and Rango to come crying back for their jobs. Panamera easily solves the problem by ordering her men to build a new carriage and offering her elite warhorses to pull it. She assures the brothers that her warhorses possess incredible speed and stamina. Later on the road, the two greedy senior merchants are gloating in their carriage about their supposed victory. Suddenly, Panamera blasts past them on her warhorse, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. The older merchants are left in absolute shock, realizing that Belle and Rango have allied with a viscountess and are successfully forming their own company. Meanwhile, Panamera arrives at the royal capital and presents herself before King Dino in the grand audience chamber. The king assumes she wants another promotion for herself, but she explicitly requests a noble title for Van. King Dino questions why an 8-year-old boy in a remote village deserves such an honor. Panamera details Van's incredible achievements, explaining how he defeated a bandit army without casualties, used his unique production magic to instantly construct massive walls and a moat, and successfully orchestrated the slaying of a massive forest dragon. The king is highly skeptical of these claims until Panamera presents a massive dragon fang as undeniable proof. She urges the king to grant Van a larger territory to bolster the nation's defenses. Impressed by the evidence, King Dino decides to officially grant Van the title of Baron, and the news of the 8-year-old dragon slayer quickly spreads throughout the capital, leaving the citizens in absolute awe. Back in the village, Van's city planning proceeds flawlessly. He upgrades the uniform wooden houses into more sophisticated structures and reorganizes the village center. To further enhance their defenses and provide a symbol for the growing town, Van uses his magic to construct 2 massive stone towers, naming them Oligo Tower and Grape Tower. He proudly declares that everyone can now live in peace under the watch of these new fortifications. Till brings out a basket of homemade egg and lettuce sandwiches, and the group decides to have a picnic on the top balcony of one of the new towers. Van, Till, Esparta, and Arte enjoy the meal while admiring the sprawling view of the walled settlement below. Esparta notes that the village has grown so much it should officially be called a town. Van jokingly suggests naming it Van Town, which Esparta genuinely supports, but Van quickly shuts the idea down before it can stick. Arte timidly approaches Van and requests that he drop her formal title and simply call her Arte from now on. Van happily agrees, though he notices she still looks embarrassed by the interaction. Till then surprises everyone by bringing out a whole custard pudding and strawberry shortcakes for dessert. She explains that since Belle and Rango opened their new shop in the village, she can easily acquire all the ingredients needed for baking. The group eagerly digs into the sweets, but Till sadly refuses a slice, complaining that she has been baking and eating so much cake lately that she is starting to gain weight. Van listens to her dietary struggles with a slightly awkward expression. While looking out over the balcony, Kamsin spots a group of people approaching the village gates. They do not look like soldiers or adventurers, so Van goes down to investigate. The group turns out to be 10 weary villagers from the neighboring settlement of Sayato, located in Count Ferdinando's territory. The elderly village chief explains that their local lord conscripted all their young people for an upcoming war, leaving the elderly and the weak to handle all the labor. Without enough workers, they can no longer afford the heavy taxes imposed on them, so they traveled all the way to Van's village hoping to find help. Van knows taking in citizens from another noble's domain could cause political friction, but he refuses to turn away people in such desperate need. He immediately offers to let all of them relocate to his town permanently. He promises them new homes, plenty of food, and a complete exemption from taxes until they can get back on their feet. The Seattle villagers are completely overwhelmed by his generosity and think they have arrived in heaven. The village chief mentions that there are 300 people total back in their home settlement, and they have 10 dairy cows that can be used to transport their belongings. Van gets incredibly excited at the mention of dairy cows, instantly imagining all the cheese and butter they can produce for the town. He views this as a perfect opportunity to create a major new industry. Van immediately dispatches Ortho, Pluriel, and Varus to safely escort the remaining 300 villagers across the dangerous territory. As the massive line of refugees slowly marches through the autumn forest at sunset, Pluriel constantly yells at Ortho and Varus to stay alert, reminding them of the time they nearly got killed by the forest dragon due to their careless chatting. The weary villagers trudge along the dirt path, feeling somber and anxious about moving to a completely unknown and remote location. Ortho tries to cheer up a particularly exhausted woman by promising her that this remote village is actually a total paradise. By nightfall, the massive group finally arrives at the fortified gates. Van warmly welcomes the tired refugees and immediately treats them to a massive barbecue feast. Thick steaks and vegetable skewers roast over roaring fires in the village square. The refugees are initially hesitant to eat such high-quality food, but Van encourages them to eat their fill and rest in the newly constructed houses he prepared for them. Till and Compson happily serve the massive crowd, and the villagers eagerly devour the delicious meal, completely amazed by the incredible hospitality. After eating, a group of anxious villagers approaches Van and asks for work, terrified of becoming a burden since they have no money or savings. Van cheerfully offers them jobs running the newly built shops, managing the local inn, and cultivating the expanded farm fields. The villagers worry that they lack the experience to run actual businesses, but Van reassures them that he will assign people to handle the math and finances, allowing them to focus strictly on the labor they know best. The elderly village chief expresses his deep gratitude, promising that his people will do everything they can to help the town thrive. Till then brings out a massive batch of fresh strawberry shortcakes for the entire crowd. She explains that she used the milk from the newly arrived dairy cows to make the fresh cream. The refugees are absolutely delighted by the sweet treats, and the atmosphere in the square shifts from anxiety to pure joy. Van gives a heartfelt speech to the new residents, explaining that they are actually doing him a huge favor by moving in and helping expand the town's workforce. He promises that with the new trading company up and running, the village will only continue to develop and become even more comfortable for everyone. The crowd cheers wildly, finally feeling hope for the future after struggling just to survive for so long. As the celebration continues, Esparta approaches Van and praises the recent population boom, but he strictly reminds the young lord that 300 new residents is still a far cry from their ultimate goal of 10,000. Van simply smiles, completely unfazed by the massive challenge ahead. He confidently declares that he will keep working hard on his city building, fully determined to turn his small remote village into a massive, thriving metropolis. Van is out in the forest with his strict tutor Esparta, trying to get some studying done after finishing his daily work. Esparta refuses to let him rest and insists that studying never killed anyone. Soon after, Ortho, Pluriel, and Kusala return from their scouting mission looking incredibly guilty. They apologize to Van and explain that they accidentally discovered the entrance to a dungeon. Van is highly upset by this news because finding a dungeon means a massive flood of rowdy adventurers will soon descend upon the village. He also worries that the sudden influx of people will cause his father to find out about all the unauthorized development work he has been doing. Esparta steps in and tells Van that they have no choice but to send a messenger to the royal capital to report the discovery. Van agrees and tasks Kusala with making the solo trip to the capital to deliver the news. To make up for the dangerous journey, Van gifts Kusala a brand new short sword forged entirely from rare mithril ore. Pluriel and Ortho are instantly jealous of the precious reward and beg to switch places. Kusala joyfully grabs the glowing blade and rides off on his horse before they can take it. On the road to the capital, Kusala constantly admires his shiny new dagger and feels completely invincible. He soon spots a massive group of green-skinned orcs attacking an overturned carriage in a grassy field. Kusala charges in without hesitation. He realizes that enemies that used to give him trouble are now laughably easy to defeat with his mithril weapon. He effortlessly slices through the orcs as a flock of large flying beasts swoop down from the sky to help snatch up the remaining monsters. A couple of giant stone monsters try to ambush him. Kusala easily dodges their attacks and cuts them down in a flash. After clearing the area, Kusala finds a young girl named Flamiria hiding near the broken carriage. She thanks him profusely for saving her life and assumes he must be a famous hero. Kusala nervously blushes and introduces himself as just a humble adventurer. Flamiria explains that she is the daughter of a fallen baron whose lands were conquered. She tells him she is currently walking to the capital to find work as a maid. Hearing this, Kusala quickly offers her a ride on his horse and suggests she come live in Van's remote village instead. He promises her that there is plenty of work available and vows to protect her himself. Flamiria is touched by his kindness and happily agrees to join him. Back at the village, Van realizes he needs to prepare for the inevitable arrival of the dungeon explorers. He sits in his office with Esparta and decides to build a completely separate outpost just for the adventurers to keep them away from the main civilian population. Esparta agrees to serve as the governor of this new outpost while Van manages the main town. They also decide to establish a new security force to keep the peace. Van plans to split the forces, keeping D in charge of the Ceto Chivalric Order for the main town and creating a new Esparta Chivalric Order for the Adventurer Outpost. Van heads outside to a sandy construction site and uses his magic to rapidly build the new structures. Seeing a group of hard-working men, Van asked D to recruit them for his own chivalric order. The workers apologetically explain that Esparta already approached them and made them sign contracts for his new order. Van is totally crushed and frustrated by how fast Esparta managed to steal all the best recruits right out from under him. Shortly after, Kusala returns from his trip with Flameria riding on his horse. He introduces the former noble girl to Van and Kamsin, explaining how he rescued her on the road. Flameria praises Kusala as a legendary hero, making the blonde adventurer blush uncontrollably. Van quickly realizes that Kusala is just trying to show off for his new crush. Suddenly, a massive cloud of dust approaches the village gates. A huge gang of barbaric thugs riding horses bursts onto the scene, looking exactly like violent marauders from a post-apocalyptic wasteland. They sport bright colorful mohawks, facial scars, and heavy spiked armor. Kamsin, Arte, and the others brace themselves for a fight. The massive thugs surprisingly show concern for the kids. They warn them that it is dangerous to play outside and tell them to run back home before monsters attack. Kamsin realizes these terrifying thugs are actually just nice adventurers here for the dungeon. He points to the massive stone ramparts behind them and explains that they live right there. The thugs are completely baffled by the enormous walls and wonder how anyone could build such a fortress out in the middle of nowhere. To demonstrate, Van steps forward and unleashes his production magic. He instantly constructs a wooden fence and explodes a massive log into perfect planks right in front of their eyes. The thugs clutch their heads in absolute shock at the display of raw power. One of the thugs realizes that this little kid must be the famous Van they heard about in the capital, but he accidentally calls Van a brat. Hearing the insult, D and his heavily armored knights step out from the village. D furiously draws his massive notched sword and threatens to punish whoever disrespected his lord. The thugs try to fight back. D and his men easily parry their attacks and overpower them with a single strike of their warhammers. After getting thoroughly beaten, the Mohawk gang becomes incredibly respectful and immediately bows in unison whenever D walks by. They still find it amusing that an 8-year-old kid is in charge of the territory, but they gladly chat with Van about his life as an exiled noble. Later, Ortho and Pluriel return from properly scouting the dungeon area. Kusala introduces Flameria to them, and they head off to the inn together. Van casually mentions to Ortho that he might just build a nice new house for Kusala and Flameria to live in together. Ortho drops to the ground and screams in jealous despair at the thought of his friend getting a house and a girl before him. Pluriel ignores the drama and gives Van her scouting report. She explains that the area around the dungeon is relatively clear of monsters, but the entrance itself is located inside a dangerously deep crevice about 3 hours away by carriage. Because the environment is so harsh, normal people cannot build a proper base camp there. Pluriel smoothly manipulates the conversation. She states that while normal people would fail, a genius like Van could easily build a base for them. Van sees right through her trap and tries to refuse, claiming the forest is too dangerous and he has a strict curfew to follow. Pluriel refuses to back down. She promises to bring plenty of guards, pack delicious desserts, and invite Till, Kamsin, and Arte along to make it a fun trip. Van feels completely cornered by her unreasonable demands. Before he can argue further, Ortho overhears the plan and eagerly agrees to go round up the guards. Van is left completely stunned and defeated by his own friends. The next day, the massive group sets off in a fancy carriage toward the dungeon. Kamsin suffers from terrible motion sickness during the bumpy ride. He spends the entire trip covering his mouth to avoid throwing up, much to Van's amusement. Till and Arte have a wonderful time admiring the lush green mountains and spotting flying monsters in the sky. Outside the carriage, the Mohawk gang runs alongside them and violently slaughters a giant mossy troll just for fun. When they finally arrive at the deep crevice, Van is horrified by what he sees. The dungeon entrance sits across a massive, deadly drop. The adventurers are carelessly balancing on 2 thin, slippery logs to get across. Van immediately screams for the carriage to stop. He forces all the adventurers, including Kusala and the Mohawk thugs, to get on their knees in the dirt. He gives them a stern lecture on risk management, explaining that one tiny slip on those logs means instant death. Kusala tries to prove it is safe by hopping around on the wood. Van asks him what would happen if he kicked the log right now. Kusala realizes he would plummet to his doom and screams in terror. After ensuring everyone understands the importance of safety, Van uses his magic to instantly construct a massive, sturdy stone arch bridge across the deadly chasm. The adventurers are completely amazed and safely cross over to the dungeon entrance. Van looks at the small clearing and asks the thugs what kind of facilities they want in their new base. They immediately request gambling dens and taverns. Van flatly rejects their ideas. Instead, he gets to work building a massive 4-story traditional-style building with white walls and blue-tiled roofs. He also builds a sturdy iron gate over the dungeon entrance to prevent monsters from escaping. Once the construction is complete, Van gives the adventurers a grand tour. The first floor features a spacious rest area and storehouse. The second floor holds a massive dining hall perfect for eating competition. The third floor is a giant dormitory filled with fluffy beds. The tough Mohawk men cheer enthusiastically about having a pillow fight. Van even includes a scenic rooftop terrace and installs water tanks that collect rain to power indoor flush toilets. He explicitly warns the thugs not to drink the toilet water, though they stare back at him with completely confused expressions. Van decides to leave the management of the new base to Ortho and his team. As the sun begins to set, the Mohawk men lean out of the windows and cheer wildly at the beautiful orange sky. Van realizes he needs to hurry back to the village because Esparta will be furious if he misses his curfew. The thugs laugh at him for being a little kid afraid of his curfew. Van briefly considers destroying the entire base out of pure annoyance. Before they leave, Arte calls Van over to a dark corner of the rocky cave. She points to a massive, glowing blue crystal embedded in the wall. Van excitedly confirms that it is a huge chunk of precious mithril ore. The group celebrates the incredible find, loads the valuable crystal into their carriage, and begins the long journey back home under the night sky. When they finally reach the village, the streets are completely pitch black. As they step out of the carriage, they are greeted by Esparta standing in the shadows. He is wearing his formal suit and sporting a terrifyingly serene smile on his face. Van instantly realizes he is in huge trouble for staying out past his curfew. Panicking, he tries to drag his friends down with him. He begs Till to help, but she clutches her chest and refuses. He yells for Kamsin, but the boy is still sweating from motion sickness and cannot do anything. He even tries to blame Arte, but the timid girl simply covers her mouth in shock. Left with no other options, Van grabs Ortho by the arm and loudly declares that breaking curfew was entirely the adventurer's fault. Ortho nervously steps forward, sweating profusely, and admits that they bear some responsibility for keeping the young lord out so late. Esparta abruptly commands Ortho to follow him for a serious talk. Ortho is terrified, but Esparta gently lifts the boy's chin in the dark and leads him away into the shadows for his punishment. Arte bursts into tears and apologizes profusely as they watch the scarred adventurer get dragged away to face Esparta's wrath. The next morning, Van takes Arte for a walk through the newly expanded, pristine streets of Seattle. Arte is amazed by the village's beauty and mentions how happy everyone must be to live there. Van asks her what she personally wants to do regarding their potential engagement. Arte gets incredibly flustered and nervously admits that she genuinely wants to marry him. Van is completely caught off guard by her honest answer. Realizing what she just blurted out, Arte instantly regrets her boldness and begs him to pretend she never said anything. Van agrees to drop the subject, but he cannot hide the huge smile on his face, making Arte even more embarrassed. A bit later, the merchants Bert and Rango return to the village after their long trip to the royal capital. They successfully established Van's trading company and hand over a massive pouch containing 130 platinum coins as his share of the profits. Till is completely overwhelmed by the sheer amount of wealth and starts trembling while holding the heavy bag of money. Van asks the merchants about Panamera since she didn't return with them. Bert explains that Panamera went to report to Count Ferdinando but actually plans to acquire land right next to Van's village. He jokes that knowing Panamera, she will probably end up as the queen before anyone even realizes it. Besides the money, Bert and Rango present Van with a special souvenir from the capital. They hand him a brand new mechanical repeating crossbow capable of firing 10 shots in a row. Van completely ignores the massive pile of platinum coins and cheers enthusiastically over the wooden crossbow, thrilled at the prospect of reverse engineering it to build better ballistae. Till just stands there clutching the fortune, totally baffled by his priorities. Van retreats to his study with Arte and Till to test out the new crossbow mechanism. He attempts to use his production magic to replicate the firing lever, but the newly created stone mechanism jams and fails to move. Arte is surprised to see Van actually fail at something. Van humbly admits that aside from his unique production magic, he lacks any real talent. Arte aggressively denies this, pointing out his incredible skills in both swordplay and academics. Van casually brushes off her compliments and asks Arte about her own magical aptitude, since she never talks about it. Arte looks deeply distressed and hesitates before finally revealing that she possesses marionette magic. She explains that just like Van's production magic, the nobility considers marionette magic completely useless, so she has always hidden it to avoid being mocked. Van is fascinated and begs her to show him how it works. He uses his magic to instantly craft a small, intricate wooden doll for her. Arte concentrates her energy, and a glowing purple aura surrounds her hands. She perfectly manipulates the small doll, making it float into the air and perform a lively dance on the table. Van and Till are mesmerized by the delicate movements of the puppet. Till claps excitedly and suggests that Arte should put on a public performance for the entire village. Van fully agrees, offering to build her an even better puppet using the rare mithril ore they found at the dungeon. Arte strongly rejects the idea, claiming her magic is only fit for criminals and is nothing but an embarrassment. Van counters her insecurities by reminding her that his own magic was once called garbage by his father, but he still used it to bring happiness to the people of Seattle. He assures Arte that her magic holds the exact same potential to bring joy to others. Touched by his unwavering belief in her, Arte agrees to give it a try and push past her lifelong fears. That night, Van gathers the entire population of the village, including the local townspeople and the rowdy adventurers, in front of a large outdoor stage. The crowd murmurs in confusion, wondering why they were summoned. Van steps out from behind the red curtains and announces that Arte will be performing a special magic show for them. The curtains open to reveal Arte standing next to a stunning, life-size mechanical doll dressed in white and purple armor with a wide-brimmed hat. As soon as the crowd realizes she is using marionette magic, some people start whispering negatively, recalling rumors that marionette magic is only used by assassins to murder nobles. Arte hears the harsh whispers and instantly freezes up in terror, her hands trembling as she loses control of the doll. Van steps up to the edge of the stage and scolds the crowd for their prejudice. He publicly defends Arte, stating that her magic is beautiful and they are about to witness something incredible. Hearing Van's confident words, Arte remembers all the happy times they have shared together and finds the courage to continue. She opens her eyes with renewed determination and resumes her control over the doll. The life-sized puppet gracefully glides across the wooden stage, executing perfect spins and elegant dance steps under the bright spotlights. The crowd is completely captivated by the fluid, lifelike movements of the armored figure. By the end of the performance, the villagers and the tough adventurers are all cheering wildly, completely blown away by the beauty of the marionette magic. Arte is so overwhelmed by the positive response that she bursts into happy tears and throws her arms around Van, thanking him for helping her find her self-worth. The heartwarming moment is interrupted when a panicked scout runs through the streets, shouting that a royal carriage is approaching the village gates. Van quickly gathers Arte, Esparda, Kamsin, and Panamera to greet the unexpected visitors. King Dino and his chancellor, Aperta, step out of the carriage to address Van. The king formally recognizes Van's achievements and officially promotes him to the rank of Baron. He explains that he came all the way from the capital to personally verify the outrageous reports about Van defeating a forest dragon and discovering a dungeon. The king sternly warns Van not to try and feed him any lies. Van respectfully accepts the terms, but asks the king to keep an open mind, warning him that the truth of his methods might seem completely unbelievable. Van leads the king, Aperta, and Panamera up to the top of the village's massive white stone ramparts to show off the heavy ballistae. Aperta is highly skeptical of the weapons, claiming that ballistae are too slow and inconvenient to be practical in a real battle. To prove him wrong, Van orders Kamsin to demonstrate. Kamsin pulls the lever on one of the heavy ballistae, launching a massive projectile high into the air. The bolt flies an absurd distance over the forest and impacts the ground with the force of an explosive missile. The king and Aperta are completely terrified by the sheer destructive power and range of the weapon. Van casually explains that the star-shaped design of the fortress allows them to rain these explosive bolts down on enemies from every possible angle. Aperta then asks how Van managed to build such complex defenses and a sprawling town in just 4 months. Van happily admits that he built everything himself using his production magic. The king completely refuses to believe that a young boy could construct an entire fortress alone and demands a live demonstration of his abilities. Van agrees to show them and leads the royal group down into the town toward the lake. As they walk through the streets, the local villagers casually wave and chat with Van, which deeply confuses the king, who expects commoners to fear their lord. Their confusion only grows when they run into a group of massive, heavily armored adventurers sporting bright, colorful mohawks. The thugs are hoisting wooden barrels and cheering wildly in the middle of the street. The king and Aperta stare in absolute disbelief at the bizarre warriors, but Van just smiles and explains that they are friendly adventurers here for the dungeon. When they finally reach the lake, the king receives another massive shock. A group of rare, legendary Apkalu emerge from the water, led by their chieftain, Latavesta. The king is stunned to see such mythical beings living openly in Van's territory. Latavesta respectfully greets the king and introduces himself. As a token of friendship, the merman hands Van a massive chunk of glowing pink orichalcum. Aperta loses his mind, screaming that the legendary metal is worth an absolute fortune. Without a second thought, Van uses his production magic to instantly transform the priceless orichalcum chunk into a perfectly forged pink-bladed sword right in front of the king's eyes. The king is completely dumbfounded and finally realizes that Van has been telling the absolute truth about his godlike building powers. Acknowledging Van's immense value, the king offers to grant him any reward he desires, expecting Van to ask for a position in the royal capital. Instead, Van begs the king to grant him permanent residency in this remote village so he can protect his people and live a peaceful, lazy life. The king agrees, deciding to treat Van as a true equal from now on. The king then mentions he wants to inspect the dungeon next before he has to return home. Van advises against it since the dungeon is a full day's trip away. Suddenly, the warning bells ring out across the village. A panicked guard rushes over, screaming that a massive forest dragon is flying straight toward the town. Van immediately drops his casual attitude and orders everyone to man the defenses and alert the adventurers as the giant gray beast darkens the sky above them. Morgana looks up at the sky and realizes that the massive beast flying toward the town is actually a wyvern. King Dino and Chancellor Aperta stand on the wall and observe the creature closely. Aperta notes that wyverns are strictly pack animals and would never attack a settlement on their own. He deduces that there must be a mage hiding nearby controlling the beast. Dino suspects that the neighboring kingdom of Yelenetta is behind this sudden aggression. Van stands nearby and states that the wyvern is flying too high for their standard ballistas to reach. He decides that they have no choice but to deploy his new prototype weapon. Meanwhile, deep within a lush forest, Prince Unimog Yelenetta marches forward with his vanguard troops. He aggressively complains about being forced to lead an invasion against such an insignificant remote village. His soldier reminds him that the king specifically entrusted him with this operation to finally settle their long-standing rivalry with the Scuderia kingdom. Unimog regains his confidence and claims that conquering this territory will be a walk in the park. As they emerge from the trees, the Yelenetta forces are confronted by the massive stone walls of Sato. Unimog screams in total disbelief at the sight of a fully developed fortress city in the middle of a wasteland. He refuses to accept reality and loudly declares that the walls are just a fake facade designed to scare them off. A soldier timidly suggests that the fortress might be real, but Unimog angrily insults him and orders his men to advance. The armored soldiers rush forward carrying a massive wooden battering ram. They repeatedly smash the heavy log into the wooden gate with all their strength. The sturdy gate absorbs every single impact without taking a scratch. The soldiers stop and stare at the undamaged wall in complete shock. Van leans over the top of the stone rampart and cheerfully greets the attackers. Unimog looks up and is completely baffled to see a young boy in charge of the fortress. Van casually asks what brings them all the way from the Yelenetta kingdom. Unimog furiously demands to know how Van figured out their true origin. Van laughs and admits he was just bluffing, but Unimog fell for the trick and confessed immediately. Humiliated and enraged, Unimog yells at Van to come down and fight. He refuses to go easy on a child and decides to use his aerial advantage. He commands his soldiers to send a message to the hidden mage controlling the wyvern. The soldiers hesitate and warn him that the mage might get counterattacked, but Unimog calls them idiots. He insists that a dragon can never lose and wants to teach Van the true terror of an aerial assault. Van watches the black wyvern circle above and calmly asks if the attackers really want to continue with this fight. Panamera stands ready beside a massive, multi-armed ballista mounted on the wall. She gives the order to fire, and the machine launches a specialized projectile high into the sky. The object erupts into a massive black explosion right next to the wyvern. The blast rips through the air, sending the wyvern and its rider plummeting toward the earth. A thick cloud of dust kicks up as debris and countless metal shurikens rain down around the Yelenetta soldiers. Unimog cowers on the ground and covers his head, completely terrified by the sudden destruction. Van laughs happily and explains to his allies that he packed the bomb with thin, light shurikens to maximize the shrapnel damage. King Dino and Aperta watch the display from the wall in awe. Dino notes the ridiculous amount of force behind the weapon, comparing its threat level to a high-ranking elemental mage. Unimog looks up, recognizes the king of Scuderia standing on the wall, and panics even more. His surviving soldiers begin to flee in terror, leaving him entirely exposed. Unimog begs his men to come back and protect him from the counterattack. Panamera leans over the wall and aggressively warns him that her next shot will definitely not miss. A massive metal spear slams into the ground right between Unimog's legs, causing him to scream in absolute horror. He immediately gives up and is taken prisoner. King Dino is thoroughly impressed by Van's defenses and the element of surprise he brings to a battle. Aperta mentions the widespread rumors about Marquis Fertio driving Van out of his home due to his supposedly low magical aptitude. Dino decides that once they return to the royal capital, The kingdom needs to seriously reconsider how it evaluates magical talent. Unimog is dragged into a dark interrogation room and forced to his knees. He sits stubbornly and refuses to reveal his kingdom's overall invasion strategy. Panamera steps forward with her sword drawn and presses the sharp blade directly against his throat. She smiles menacingly and asks if he would prefer to have his fingernails ripped out one by one or his eyes gouged out. Unimog instantly breaks down in tears and agrees to talk. He explains that Yeleneta has been planning this full-scale invasion for several years. They intended to take Van's remote village easily before moving on to larger targets. However, he reveals that their main military force is currently attacking their true objective, the impregnable fortress city of Skudet. Panamera and Aperte are completely shocked by this revelation. They quickly relay the critical information to King Dino. Dino realizes the extreme severity of the situation and decides they must hasten back to the royal capital to marshal their knights for Skudet's defense. The group gathers around a long wooden table to discuss their immediate next moves. King Dino formally requests that Van join them in the defense of Skudet. Van firmly declines the royal request. He explains that his village is still developing and leaving it now would be the exact same as abandoning it. Dino points out that the village already possesses weapons capable of killing dragons, but Van insists he has only completed a tiny fraction of his overall vision. Panamera laughs boisterously at Van's endless ambition but quickly reminds him of his strict, noble obligations. She explains that coming to the nation's aid during a major crisis is a mandatory duty for all nobles. Understanding that he truly has no choice in the matter, Van agrees to participate in the war. However, he demands the right to organize his own troops for the expedition. Dino grants him full permission to handle his forces as he wishes. Van heads outside and meets with Esparta in front of the main building. He asks the old butler to stay behind as the acting lord to protect the village. Esparta accepts the heavy responsibility without any hesitation. Van then turns to D and confirms that the Sayato chivalric order will accompany him to the battlefield. Till, Kamzin, and Arte immediately step forward and insist on coming along as well. Van nervously agrees to bring them, but worries his small group will look incredibly pathetic when they finally arrive to help the royal army. D assures him that anyone who knows Van's true power will understand their worth, but admits that outsiders might easily judge them. Seeking more manpower to bolster his ranks, Van approaches the local adventurers in the town square. Ortho, Pluriel, and Kusala listen closely as Van offers them a highly paid escort quest. He promises to pay them 1 large gold coin and 5 regular gold coins per person for their services. Ortho and Pluriel gladly accept the generous offer. Kusala complains loudly about being forced into another highly dangerous job without a real choice. Van simply smiles and tells Kusala that if he refuses the quest, he will absolutely not be allowed to attend the upcoming village barbecue. Horrified at the terrible thought of missing out on the massive feast, Kusala instantly changes his mind and joins the squad. Panamera informs Van that she must return to Count Ferdinando to report the situation and gather her own troops before heading to Skudet. Van realizes he cannot easily transport his massive ballistae to the distant battlefield. Arte steps up and offers to bring her marionette doll to serve as their heavy artillery. Van gladly accepts her help. Later, Van stands before his newly assembled forces in a wide dirt field. He addresses the diverse group of knights, spearmen, and adventurers. He makes it completely clear that their objective is not to charge blindly into the front lines and die for glory. His primary goal as their lord is to ensure that every single person returns to the village alive and completely unharmed. He promises to do everything in his power to protect them all and asks them to deeply value their own lives. He finishes his motivational speech by declaring that once the battle is finally over, they will all come home and enjoy another massive barbecue together. The men cheer enthusiastically at the prospect of food and survival. Meanwhile, in a grand office far away, Marquis Jalpa receives an urgent report that Skudet has been brutally attacked by Yeleneta forces. Jalpa cannot believe the impregnable fortress is in actual danger and immediately orders his troops to marshal. His advisor suggests requesting aid from Van's nearby village. Jalpa angrily scoffs at the idea, claiming Van's village is far too poor to provide any useful troops. The advisor mentions the growing rumors of Van earning a Baron title by defeating a forest dragon, but Jalpa violently dismisses it as absolute drivel since Van lacks any combat-oriented elemental magic. He demands they hurry to Skudet without asking for help. Sometime later, Jalpa and his knights arrive at the south gate of Skudet, only to find the entire fortress city heavily damaged and smoking. The dark sky is completely filled with Yeleneta wyverns raining destruction down upon the walls. Jalpa's forces are completely overwhelmed by the enemy's massive numbers and their explosive new weapons. Surrounded by his fallen and wounded soldiers, Jalpa watches in total despair as his army is nearly wiped out. Just as he prepares for the bitter end, the enemy wyverns suddenly break off their relentless attack. They turn around and fly rapidly toward the west gate, completely ignoring the surviving Scuderia knights. Jalpa is left utterly confused by their sudden, unprovoked retreat. The wyverns have redirected their attention solely because Van's reinforcements have finally arrived at the west gate. A massive gray owl-like creature carrying Arte's armored doll lands right in front of the fortress wall, kicking up a huge cloud of dust. The Yeleneta knights charge forward, demanding the strange machine be crushed immediately. Arte closes her eyes, and a radiant purple aura intensely surrounds her entire body. She uses her unique marionette magic to flawlessly control the life-sized doll. The armored figure wields a large sword and a glowing shield, effortlessly slicing through the descending enemy wyverns and perfectly deflecting their magical attacks. The surrounding soldiers are utterly amazed by Arte's incredible destructive power. Van plans to draw as much enemy attention as possible to give the battered Scuderia knights enough time to retreat safely. Kamsin steps up with a large wooden repeating crossbow and unleashes a rapid volley of bolts straight into the charging enemy knights. The Yeleneta soldiers try to push through the barrage, but Van's hired adventurers aggressively intercept them. Ortho swings his massive sword, cutting down heavily armored foes with absolute ease. Pluriel uses her staff to blast the enemies with shattering ice magic from a distance. Kusala dashes through the chaos with his daggers, laughing maniacally as he swiftly takes out multiple targets. Van smiles broadly as his small squad easily dominates the crowded battlefield. Seeing that they have successfully lured a massive horde of enemies away from the main fortress, Van decides they have done more than enough. Ortho reminds the eager adventurers that their goal is not to win the entire war by themselves. He loudly reiterates Van's strict rule that everyone must survive the day. Van cheerfully commands his entire squad to run away as fast as they physically can. The group completely abandons the active fight and sprints back toward the safety of the distant forest, leaving the highly confused Yeleneta forces behind. Back at a secure regrouping point, Jalpa frantically tries to organize a counterattack to somehow retake Scudet. His eldest son, Morcia, finally arrives at the camp and apologizes for his long delay. King Dino and Empress Elmezia soon join them at the command tent. Jalpa formally reports that Scudet has officially fallen and his proud knights were nearly annihilated. He explains that they only survived because the enemy wyverns were suddenly distracted by unknown reinforcements arriving at the west gate. Dino instantly realizes that the massive distraction was caused by Baron Van. Hearing his estranged son's name spoken with such respect, Jalpa breaks into a cold sweat and stares at the king in absolute shock. The king recounts the legendary feats Van has recently accomplished, detailing how the young boy developed a thriving remote village and single-handedly destroyed a colossal green dragon with a massive energy blast. Dino confirms that these incredible achievements easily earned Van his Baron title at such a young age. Jalpa stammers in pure disbelief, insisting that Van possesses absolutely no elemental magic and could not possibly do such things. Dino glares sharply at Jalpa and asks if the Marquis is directly accusing the king of lying. Jalpa immediately backpedals in terror and bows his head deeply. Dino questions if Jalpa is just bitter and frustrated that his discarded son is finding much more glory than his chosen heir. Empress Elmezia smiles warmly and states that she is incredibly proud of Van's massive success, leaving Jalpa completely speechless and humiliated. Later that night, Van and his squad set up a quiet campfire deep within a dark forest. They sit around the warm flames to rest after their chaotic retreat from the fortress. Arte looks down at the ground with a deeply saddened and traumatized expression. She openly admits that this was her first time witnessing a real war, and she found it to be a terrifying, awful place where innocent people are brutally slaughtered. She clearly states that she never wants to go anywhere near a battlefield again. Van listens closely and fully agrees with her sentiments. He feels they have already fulfilled their noble duty by providing a major distraction, but he also knows that leaving Scudet occupied by the enemy remains a long-term threat to their own village's safety. To solve the massive problem without forcing his people back into frontline combat, Van decides to build a brand new long-range weapon. He plans to construct 20 stationary catapults and 5 mobile ones to safely bombard the enemy from a massive distance. Someone quickly points out that transporting massive wooden catapults over the ruined roads will be entirely impossible. Van simply smiles and declares that he will just use his production magic to instantly craft all the heavy artillery on site. He excitedly raises his fist into the air and happily announces the start of their strategy meeting for the next day's counterattack. The next day, as the group makes their way toward the fortress city of Skudet, Arte looks incredibly distressed and complains about returning to a battlefield because she absolutely hates the idea of war. Van points out a nearby city where the Scuderian army is currently reorganizing their forces after their previous defeat. They notice a massive number of soldiers preparing for combat and discuss the terrifying effectiveness of Yeleneda's new weapons, specifically the wyverns and their explosive black balls. As they walk through the bustling streets, Van spots his father, Marquis Jalpa, standing with a group of heavily armored knights. Van casually greets him, noting that it has been a long time since they last saw each other. Jalpa mentions hearing that Van was recently made a baron after supposedly defeating a dragon. Van clarifies that it was only a forest dragon and that he used his ballista to take it down, but Jalpa immediately dismisses the claim as impossible, stating that even his entire force of elite knights struggles against beasts of that class. Before the family tension can escalate, Panamera arrives and happily interrupts the conversation. She informs Jalpa that King Dino is eagerly waiting for them to begin the strategy meeting. Panamera then turns to Van and asks if he is willing to sell her some of his newly developed ballistae. Van agrees to prepare some for her soon and says they can discuss the pricing details later. The group heads inside a grand stone building guarded by elite royal soldiers and enters a massive wood-paneled conference room. They sit at a long table alongside King Dino, Chancellor Aperta, and Earl Ferdinando, who happens to be Arte's father. Aperta opens the meeting by stating that Yeleneda captured Skudet so quickly because of their wyverns and black balls, meaning the Scuderian army cannot possibly win unless they find a way to counter the aerial assaults. King Dino asks Van if he has a strategy to quickly eliminate the wyverns before they can drop their explosives. The older nobles, including Jalpa, openly mock the idea, calling it childish nonsense and stating that taking down wyverns is incredibly difficult. King Dino then asks Van to join the front lines of the upcoming operation so he can earn some glory for himself. Van immediately refuses the royal request, explaining that he only wants to act in a support role from the rear because he has no desire to get hurt. The room erupts in anger as the nobles call him a selfish, impudent brat who does not know his place as the lord of a minor remote village. Van stands his ground and explains that none of the high-ranking nobles understand what it is like to desperately defend a tiny settlement. He reveals that Yeleneda already sent a reconnaissance force to attack his village, meaning they are fully serious about conquering the border domains. Van states that he has worked incredibly hard to develop his territory and protect his citizens, so he cannot afford to die or get injured in a reckless frontline charge. King Dino listens carefully and accepts Van's reasoning, understanding his deep dedication to his people. Van promises that in exchange for staying in the rear, he will prepare his new ballistae and catapults to support the army. Jalpa scoffs and points out that they are in a race against time, making it impossible to build siege weapons from scratch. Van confidently asks his father to follow him outside to the courtyard. He raises his hand and uses his production magic to instantly materialize a massive wooden catapult and a fully functional ballista in a flash of bright light. The king and the other officials are utterly shocked by the immediate creation of the heavy artillery. Jalpa refuses to acknowledge Van's skill, dismissing the weapons as mere props for show, and walks away to reorganize his troops. King Dino, however, is deeply impressed by the catapults, which Van explains are designed to launch specialized shurikens to take down the wyverns. The king formally entrusts the success of the anti-air operation to Van. As the meeting concludes and the group disperses, Till and Arte meet up with Van outside the building. Arte notices her father, Earl Ferdinando, walking past and nervously calls out to him. She asks if her mother is doing well, and Ferdinando briefly confirms that she is safe in his domain. However, he quickly brushes Arte off, stating that he is far too busy preparing for war to have a proper conversation with her. Arte looks deeply saddened by his cold dismissal and lowers her head in disappointment. Van approaches her to make sure she is feeling okay and instructs Till to stay closely by her side. Van then regroups with Kamsin and officially places him in charge of the artillery squad. Panamera watches them prepare and notes that Yeleneda's swift capture of Skudet proves the era of battles being decided solely by elemental mages is finally over. She realizes that Van's innovative weapons now represent the greatest military might in the kingdom. The operation to retake Skudet officially begins as the Scuderian army marches toward the massive stone walls of the fortress. Jalpa shouts orders, commanding his troops to split into two groups and advance cautiously. Van stays in the rear with his team, reminding everyone that their primary goal is to defeat the wyverns and ensure they all survive. Kusala, Pluriel, and Ortho act as a highly mobile strike unit, darting across the battlefield to support the thinnest ranks. Meanwhile, D and the heavily armored Citeaux Chivalric Order form a defensive perimeter around Kamsin's artillery squad. From the top of the fortress wall, a green-haired Yeleneta commander spots the approaching army and orders his archers to unleash a massive volley of silver-tipped arrows. The Scuderian soldiers quickly raise large circular metal shields reinforced with Van's wooden blocks, perfectly blocking the deadly rain of arrows. Frustrated, the Yeleneta commander orders his mages to attack. The hooded figures raise their staffs and fire brilliant beams of red, green, and blue magic that crash into the shield wall, causing massive explosions. The defensive line begins to buckle under the intense magical bombardment, and the Yeleneta commander thinks he has the upper hand. However, the frontal assault is actually a deliberate distraction. A detached strike force led by Jalpa and Ferdinando suddenly attacks the north gate. Murcia uses his wind magic to sweep away the defenders, while Panamera hurls explosive fire javelins into the enemy ranks. Jalpa and Ferdinando then stand back to back, simultaneously charging their strongest elemental spells. They combine Jalpa's swirling ice magic with Ferdinando's roaring flames, creating a massive hybrid beam of energy that completely obliterates the heavy stone gate in a spectacular explosion. Watching from afar, Van is genuinely amazed by the sheer destructive power his father and the Earl possess. With the gate destroyed, the Scuderian soldiers pour into the city streets, clashing violently with the panicked Yeleneta defenders. The close-quarters combat is incredibly brutal. Ortho swings his massive sword, slicing through heavily armored enemies with ease. Kusala uses his glowing blue dagger to outmaneuver the soldiers, laughing confidently as he dominates them in hand-to-hand combat. Pluriel spins her staff and summons a massive freezing blizzard that engulfs a large group of Yeleneta troops, leaving them incapacitated on the blood-stained cobblestones. Seeing his ground forces being absolutely decimated, the green-haired Yeleneta commander grows desperate and calls in his aerial units. A massive flock of dark gray wyverns darkens the sky, preparing to drop their highly explosive black balls on the Scuderian troops below. Van immediately spots the threat and orders Comson to fire the catapults. Comson shouts the command, and the wooden machines launch their specialized black projectiles high into the air. The payloads detonate precisely amidst the flock, creating a chain reaction of fiery explosions that instantly destroys almost all of the wyvern. The burning beasts plummet from the sky, crashing into the city streets. However, one massive, terrifyingly large wyvern survives the barrage and lands heavily on the ground, letting out a deafening roar. Ortho and Kusala refuse to let it recover and immediately charge at the beast. They leap high into the air, striking the wyvern's head with their weapons and successfully pinning it down. Van quickly signals his ballista squad, and they fire a volley of heavy bolts that pierce the creature's thick hide, finally bringing the giant monster down for good. To completely secure the area, Panamera unleashes a devastating surge of fiery magic that sweeps through the streets, incinerating the last remaining pockets of enemy resistance and turning their cover to ash. The Scuderian soldiers erupt into victorious cheers as they realize the wyvern threat has been completely neutralized and the fortress is theirs once again. Realizing he has suffered a total defeat, the Yeleneta commander attempts to quietly slip away, but Ortho and Kusala easily corner him, forcing him to surrender without a fight. As the golden sunset bathes the conquered city in warm light, Jalpa and Murcia walk away from the battlefield. Murcia asks his father if he truly intends to leave without congratulating Van or even speaking to him. Jalpa looks out over the horizon and quietly admits that his harsh beliefs about his son's worth might have been entirely wrong. Meanwhile, back in the stone hall of the fortress, Van celebrates the victory with his loyal squad. He humbly refuses to take all the credit, insisting that their success was solely due to everyone's hard work and bravery. Ortho, Pluriel, and Kusala then drag the captured Yeleneta commander into the room and throw him before the group. Panamera steps forward with a menacing smirk and aggressively interrogates the sweating, terrified commander about his kingdom's true objectives. Broken and defeated, the commander confesses that Yeleneta's invasion was actually planned as a massive three-pronged attack. He reveals that Cieto and Scude were only the first two targets, and the final prong of their invasion force is currently marching on Ferdinando County. Standing nearby, Arte hears the terrifying news, and her eyes widen in absolute horror as she realizes that her homeland, and potentially her mother, are the enemy's next victims. Hearing that her homeland is the final target, Arte immediately visualizes the terrified villagers and the burning buildings of her home. She meets with Van and his advisors in a dimly lit room to discuss the situation. Van confirms that Ferdinand County is the last target of the Yeleneta invasion. Arte firmly requests permission to go to her homeland to save it. Van instantly offers to accompany her and fight, but Arte strictly refuses his help. She explains that she cannot keep depending on him for everything and that this is a matter House Ferdinand must resolve itself. Later that night in the stone courtyard, Arte approaches Van and apologizes for being so stubborn about the situation. Van admits he understands her reasoning. He realizes that if he, the lord of a backwater village, steps in to save Count Ferdinand, it would severely damage the Count's reputation and likely cause him to lose his territory. Panamera agrees with this assessment but suggests that Arte should at least take a small group of guards with her. Ortho, Pluriel, and Kusala quickly volunteer for the job. They assure Ban that since they are just adventurers, no one in the noble society will bat an eye if they participate in the battle. Van accepts their offer and asks them to protect Arte. Arte looks at the horizon and cries for her mother. The next day, Arte and her guards arrive at the outskirts of Ferdinand County, only to find the city already engulfed in flames. Massive Yeleneta wyverns soar through the cloudy sky, dropping explosive onyx spears that obliterate the stone buildings and cause massive casualties. Ortho immediately suggests that they charge into the battle and offers to take command of the unit. Arte rejects his proposal, explaining that the one to drive the invaders away must be a member of House Ferdinand to preserve the family's honor. Ortho asks how she plans to fight them off. Looking at the destruction, Arte recalls a painful memory from her past. Her mother, Sharon, told her to hold back her tears while explaining that she would fake Arte's death to make it look like a suicide. Sharon claimed this would give Arte an honorable end, befitting a noble, completely discarding her from the family because of her heavily stigmatized marionette magic. Back in the present, the Yeleneta ground troops march through the streets, confident that victory is already theirs. However, their celebration is cut short when a silver-armored knight suddenly drops from the sky and begins slaughtering their wyverns. Following the first attacker, a second knight in light blue armor maneuvers through the air, easily slicing through Yeleneta's mechanical golems and giant bird creatures. The Yeleneta soldiers panic, unable to comprehend how two knights are dismantling their entire aerial fleet. Soon, the enemy troops spot the purple flag of House Ferdinand waving on a distant hill. The Yeleneta commander orders his men to charge the hill and crush the remaining resistance. Watching the massive army approach, Arte admits that she is terrified and lacks Van's combat experience. Her hands tremble, but she grips her dress, steels her resolve, and asks her guards to follow her lead. She declares that she will fight on the front lines to save her home. Arte deploys her automaton, Uno, which immediately leaps into the fray alongside Ortho and the other adventurers. Ortho clashes his heavy sword against the silver-armored Yeleneta knights, easily overpowering them in close combat. Pluriel uses her magical staff to launch purple crystals that freeze the enemy soldiers' legs in blocks of solid ice. Kusala takes advantage of the immobilized troops, smashing them with a metal pipe and his dagger. A Yeleneta knight tries to sneak up on Kusala, but one of Arte's four-armed automatons steps in to block the strike. The automaton loses an arm in the process but continues to fight, leaping into the sky and raining sword strikes down on the enemy. Ortho, Pluriel, and the automatons quickly wipe out the ground forces in their immediate area. Ortho confidently states that they have secured the sector, but Pluriel points to the sky in horror. A massive swarm of at least 50 Yeleneta wyverns approaches the city. The Yeleneta commander spots the automatons and orders the wyvern riders to destroy them. Knowing she has to push past her limits, Arte summons a second automaton and controls both of them simultaneously. She uses her magical energy to guide the armored figures through the sky, unleashing devastating energy slashes that tear through the wyvern fleet. Controlling multiple puppets drains her magic rapidly, but she refuses to give up. Arte remembers how everyone irrationally hated her marionette magic, prompting her to swear she would never use it again. She remembers packing away all her dolls and accepting her uselessness, but she also remembers how Van saved her, praised her abilities, and gave her the confidence to believe in herself. Fueled by this realization, Arte projects a massive pink and purple magical aura. She takes to the sky on a floating purple shield and directs her automatons to strike down the remaining wyvern riders with overwhelming force. Seeing their aerial support annihilated, the surviving Yeleneta ground troops realize they have no chance of winning and completely rout, fleeing the city in terror. Ortho cheers for their victory, while Arte approaches her heavily damaged automatons and thanks them for saving her home. Inside the Grand Castle, Earl Ferdinando enters the safe room and informs his wife, Sharon, that the Yeleneta army was successfully driven away. He reveals that the forces were routed by two dolls commanded by a young girl with white hair. Sharon's eyes widen in shock as she realizes that the savior of their territory is the very daughter she discarded. She breaks down in tears, fully grasping the grave injustice she committed against Arte. Outside the city walls, Ortho points out that Arte's parents are in the castle and suggests she go pay them a visit. Arte declines the offer. She believes her presence would only be a bother and assumes her mother still despises her magic. She turns her back on her homeland and tells her friends that she just wants to go home to Van. Sometime later, Arte arrives back at Van's village, where a crowd gathers to welcome her at the gate. Despite her success, Arte feels inadequate and confesses to Van that she didn't have the confidence to command the troops as well as he does. Van completely disagrees, praising her for her amazing ability to control the dolls and pointing out how much happier she is now compared to when they first met. He gives her a warm smile and welcomes her home, causing Arte to cry tears of joy. Life in Van's territory continues to flourish. He proudly shows off several new shops and a large inn he recently constructed in the center of town. The once impoverished village has transformed into a bustling, colorful city under a bright blue sky. The citizens go about their daily lives with ease, and Van is thrilled to see his efforts paying off. The diverse population gets along perfectly. The rugged, mohawk-wearing warriors cheerfully carry the elderly and young children around town on their shoulders. Down by the water, the aquatic Apkalu people splash in the river and tend to the cows. Fully integrated into the community, the town square is constantly filled with people drinking, eating skewers, and socializing. Panamera visits the village and immediately impresses everyone by downing massive barrels of alcohol without breaking a sweat. As Van watches his people thrive, he reflects on his journey. He remembers being exiled by his father simply because his production magic was deemed useless. He was sent to this remote, run-down village and was expected to lose his place in the world. Instead, he gathered a loyal group of friends, built incredible defenses, and turned the settlement into an irreplaceable home. His peaceful reflection is suddenly interrupted by Esparta, who sternly informs Van that it is time for his rigorous academic studies so he can become the kingdom's top scholar. Before Van can complain, Dee marches over with his massive sword, demanding that Van skip the books and train to become the kingdom's #1 swordsman. Having absolutely no desire to do either, Van turns around and runs away as fast as he can. Esparta and Dee chase him through the streets while the rest of the villagers, including Till, Kamsin, Ortho, Panamera, and Arte, cheer Van on and laugh at the chaotic scene. As Van sprints through his town, he uses his production magic to instantly reinforce the village defenses by placing his hand on the earth. When a pack of scaly, green reptilian monsters attempts to charge the settlement, they are immediately annihilated by a massive volley of arrows from Van's automated ballistae. In another part of the town, catapults launch heavy black projectiles that obliterate a swarm of dark-winged creatures in the sky with a blinding white explosion. With the village perfectly secure, Van smiles and pumps his fists, determined to take life at his own pace and keep making his territory a fun, safe place for everyone.